Chapter 20. Hong Chuan's expression changed several times. In the end, he let out a long sigh and said, "I didn't expect it to be like this. Thank you, Brother Lu, for saving my life." Lu Chen grinned and waved his hand to show that it was not worth mentioning. Then he said, "By the way, Brother Hong, I remember that when you left yesterday, you were clearly going to the Wailing Ghost Cave, right? Why did you suddenly faint and fall into the pool in the middle of the night?" Hong Chuan hesitated for a moment, then he shook his head and smiled bitterly. "This is really a long story. Actually, after I went up the mountain yesterday, I did plan to go to the cave. Who knew, then, he did not hide it from Lu Chen, or perhaps because Lu Chen had saved his life, so he told Lu Chen everything that happened yesterday. It turned out that after Hong Chuan went up the Tea Mountain yesterday, because it was his first time coming to this mountain, and the front mountain was planted with spirit tea trees everywhere, densely crisscrossing, even the mountain path on the mountain was like a maze. If people who were not familiar with the terrain walked on the mountain, it was really easy to get lost. Hong Chuan was like this. In the beginning, he just randomly picked a mountain path to walk up the mountain. Anyway, he just kept walking towards the top. Who knew that after walking halfway up the mountain, he began to feel that something was wrong. There were always several forks in front of him, and some of the mountain paths that he had chosen seemed to extend to the top of the mountain, but as he walked, the direction changed. He didn't go to the east, but to the west. As a result, Hong Chuan was a little anxious, and quickly turned back to walk again. Who knew that the more busy he was, the more wrong this path became, and the sky also darkened at this time. After the sky turned dark, the Tea Mountain was gloomy and dim, even identifying the road was very difficult. Although Hong Chuan carried a torch with him to light up the mountain wind was too strong, and the fire could not illuminate too far. He walked further and further, and then at a certain moment, he suddenly found that a lake on the mountain appeared in front of him. Hearing this, Lu Chen also laughed and shook his head, saying, "So, you went to the Dragon Lake by mistake." "Dragon Lake?" Hong Chuan asked curiously. Lu Chen nodded and said, "That's right, the name of the place has been passed down by the villagers since ancient times. The lake on the mountain is called the Dragon Lake, and the pool at the foot of the mountain is called the Dragon Pond. It is said that in ancient times, there was a dragon living here, and that the water on the mountain and at the foot of the mountain are connected. Of course, whether it's true or not depends on whether you believe it or not." As he spoke, Lu Chen laughed. Hong Chuan also smiled. Such far-fetched names were a common sight in the divine central continent. There were at least 7,000 or 8,000 places in the world named after dragons. Dragon mountains, dragon seas, dragon lakes, dragon veins, dragon hills, dragon fields, and so on could be seen and heard everywhere. Especially in remote and desolate areas, they were the most popular. Moreover, the natives of almost every place could tell you a magical and distant legend. Perhaps it was because in ancient times, the divine dragons who could ride the clouds and ride the mist had left an indelible magical impression in people's minds. However, anyone with a bit of knowledge would mostly dismiss these names with a laugh. As for the reason, it was very simple. Even if the ancient divine dragons did descend to the human world, even if all the dragons worked hard to live in those legends, they could only play less than 1% of the roles in those stories. Humans were too passionate, and there were too many legends. There were not enough divine dragons. Hong Chuan was born in a famous sect with a long history like the Kunlun party, so he naturally had this bit of experience and knowledge. He looked at Lu Chen and smiled. But then Lu Chen frowned and said, "So, you went to the Dragon Lake on Shilu Mountain. How did you end up in this pool at the foot of the mountain?" Hong Chuan shook his head and said, "That's the strange part. When I saw the lake last night, I knew I had gone the wrong way after all. I was a little depressed, but it was already late and I might not be able to find my way back. So, I decided to spend the night by the lake and prepare to go to Fian Rock tomorrow." At this point, he paused and then remembered something. He smiled apologetically at Lu Chen and said, the Fian Rock I was talking about is that sinkhole. Please forgive me, Brother Lu. I'm used to saying it and can't change it." Lu Chen laughed and said, "You don't have to be so polite. I know. You can continue." Hong Chuan said, well, then I found a place by the lake to shelter from the wind and planned to spend the night. Who knew that in the middle of the night, when I was sleepy, I suddenly heard a strange sound from the Dragon Lake. It woke me up. Then, I saw the originally calm lake suddenly boil. A moment later, a strange fish suddenly jumped out of the water. The water splashed down and silver light shone in all directions. It was as if it really was the legendary carp transforming into a dragon. Even the usually calm Lu Chen was shocked at this moment. He said in surprise, "What?" Hong Chuan smiled bitterly and said, This is what I saw with my own eyes last night. I didn't think of it because I heard Brother Lu mention that the lake is called the Dragon Lake." Lu Chen was also speechless for a moment. Then, he heard Hong Chuan continued, "I was also stunned at that time. Because I was too surprised, I couldn't help but stand out. As a result, I only took 2 steps forward. The strange fish in the air suddenly turned its head and looked at me. According to what Hong Chuan said, that gaze seemed to contain a very strange power. Even if he had cultivation to protect himself, he still felt dizzy. Suddenly, his vision turned black and his body fell forward. In Hong Chuan's last memory, he only remembered that he staggered and fell into the lake. A cold wave of water drowned him. As for what happened after that, he had no memory. When he woke up, he was in this hut. After listening to Hong Chuan's words, Lu Chen didn't speak for a moment. He frowned and seemed to be thinking about something. After Hong Chuan glanced at him, he asked tentatively, "Brother Lu, from what you said just now, you saved me from the lake at the foot of the mountain?" Lu Chen nodded and said, "Yes, when I came out in the middle of the night, I happened to see some movement in the lake. In the end, I found you floating on the water. Otherwise, I really wouldn't have gone to the Dragon Lake to save you." Halfway through his words, he was suddenly startled and said, Could it be that the legend is actually true? The Dragon Lake on the mountain and the Dragon Lake at the foot of the mountain are actually connected by a secret water channel? Chapter 21. Hong Chuan was also dumbfounded. After a while he said, "It seems that this is the only explanation that makes sense. Brother Lu, you have lived in this village for so long. Have you heard of the legend of the strange fish in the Dragon Lake?" Lu Chen only shook his head and said, "There really isn't. The Dragon Lake and Dragon Pond, other than the grand name, there really hasn't been any activity for so many years. Like stagnant water, no one has ever seen the strange fish." For some reason, he suddenly paused at the last 2 words. Hong Chuan, however, did not notice it. He only sighed, and then with some rejoicing, he said, "No matter what, I really have to thank Brother Lu this time. Otherwise, I would have died here for no reason. It's really unjust." Lu Chen laughed and said, "It's just a small effort, Brother Hong, don't need to take it to heart." "Right, what are your plans after this? Are you going to continue to explore the Dragon Lake?" Hong Chuan pondered for a moment, shook his head and said, "The big fish in the Dragon Lake is quite strange. With my current skills, I'm afraid I still can't subdue it. I won't go and provoke it for now. If there is a chance in the future, after I return to the mountain, I will invite a few powerful senior brothers to come over. We will naturally be able to investigate." Lu Chen nodded and said, "That's fine." Hong Chuan got off the bed, tried to walk a few steps in the house, and then moved his body. Lu Chen looked at his movements and asked, "How are your injuries?" Hong Chuan said, "Shouldn't be too serious, just some impact that caused your blood and qi to be unstable. It seems that I will be fine after a day of rest." Lu Chen smiled and said, "That's the best. How about this? Since you have slept here for a night, why don't you stay here for the night? Tomorrow morning, I will go up the mountain with you to that crater, finish your work, so that you won't have to struggle again if you can't find the path." Hong Chuan was overjoyed, even his face was a little red. He said with surprise, "Brother Lu, is this true?" I. Lu Chen smiled and said, "Just leading the way, it's nothing. We're all outside, so we're just helping each other out." Hong Chuan bowed to the ground with a sincere look on his face. He looked at Lu Chen and said, "Brother Lu is really a kind person. I can't thank you enough." The disciples of the Kunlun party were known for being well-educated and well-mannered. Receiving Lu Chen's kindness, Hong Chuan's heart was immediately filled with gratitude. Not only did he desperately express his gratitude, he also insisted on giving something to Lu Chen to express his gratitude. Lu Chen just smiled and declined, saying that it was a small matter, but Hong Chuan was serious. Then, from him, Lu Chen found out that no one was willing to talk to this disciple before Lu Chen, especially after they arrived at Qingshidang village. Everyone seemed to be disgusted and guarded against him, avoiding him like the plague. Almost no one was willing to talk to him. After hearing this, Lu Chen was also stunned. Then, he thought about it and said, Brother Hong, maybe they thought that you're someone who's here to snatch the opportunity. You know, many people here have worked their whole lives just for that one opportunity. Even if they don't know each other, there's always a possibility that they'll be robbed of their opportunity. Hong Chuan was dumbfounded. Just because of this? Lu Chen also smiled bitterly and said, other than this, I can't think of any other reason. But usually, they don't act like this. Oh, right. His eyes suddenly lit up as he looked at Hong Chuan. It should be because you were wearing a long sword that day and looked like a rogue cultivator. You're much stronger than us mortals. If the Thousand Autumns sect came to take a look, they would naturally choose someone with some foundation like you. That's why those people were unwilling to talk to you. Only then did Hong Chuan come to his senses. He was speechless for a moment. But in comparison, his gratitude towards Lu Chen deepened. In the end, there was another round of gratitude and gratitude. Lu Chen almost couldn't take it anymore. In the end, Hong Chuan once again brought up giving gifts to express his gratitude. Lu Chen declined again, but this time, he didn't push it too hard. Who knew that at this moment, something extremely awkward would suddenly happen? Just a second ago, Hong Chuan had been so sure that Lu Chen wouldn't stand on ceremony and accept the gifts. But suddenly, he realized that other than the long sword that was tied on his back, his belongings and other belongings were all gone. At that moment, in the thatched hut, the two of them stared at each other. For a long time, neither spoke, or perhaps they didn't know what to say. After a long while, Lu Chen laughed dryly and said, perhaps I left them in the water last night. I wonder if Brother Hong has anything valuable that's missing? At this moment, Hong Chuan's face was red and somewhat purple. He seemed so ashamed that he almost wanted to pull out his sword and kill himself. Seeing this, Lu Chen was a little worried. But fortunately, Hong Chuan didn't seem to be so stubborn. After a while, he said with a sad face, I don't have anything important, but this, but... I'm really sorry, Brother Lu. Looking at his depressed expression, Lu Chen found it funny, but for some reason, he suddenly felt a burst of warmth in his heart. Then he shook his head slightly and said in a gentle voice, Brother Hong, do you think I'm that kind of greedy person? Hong Chuan was shocked and quickly raised his head, No, I definitely didn't mean that. Lu Chen smiled and said, if that's the case, why are you so depressed? We met by chance, it's fate. Why worry about this trivial property? Come, I'll take you to the village to drink a few cups of good wine. Meeting and getting drunk is a happy thing in life. Saying this, he stood up with a smile and led Hong Chuan out of the thatched hut, walking towards the tavern where old Ma stayed in the village. Hong Chuan looked at Lu Chen from behind. For a moment, he didn't know what to say, but his eyes were shining. Although at this moment, Lu Chen looked like an ordinary person, and he was a disciple of a famous cultivation sect, the difference in status between the two was actually quite big. But at this moment, in his eyes, Lu Chen's figure seemed to be getting bigger and bigger. When passing by the stream of Qingshui, he suddenly thought in his heart, could this be the extraordinary person that Father talked about in this world? It's such a pity that such a person is buried in this countryside. And naturally, Lu Chen didn't think that at this moment, he was following behind him in a somewhat embarrassed state. Thoughts were tumbling in Hong Chuan's mind. In fact, whether it was Hong Chuan or Lu Chen himself, they had probably inadvertently forgotten a fact, and that was that an ordinary person would almost never treat a cultivator with cultivation so calmly. Because between the two, not only was there a huge difference in strength, but there was also a huge difference in status. But to Lu Chen, everything seemed to be very natural. Not only did Hong Chuan not notice, even he himself didn't notice anything strange. Chapter 22. Lu Chen took Hong Chuan into the tavern and found that the business of the tavern was good today. Several tables were filled with guests. Old Ma sat behind the counter with a smile on his face. He seemed to be in a good mood. Lu Chen walked over and greeted Old Ma with a smile. Then he asked for a pot of wine and sat down with Hong Chuan at the table next to him. The two drank and chatted. They were very congenial and regretted not meeting each other earlier. It didn't take long for them to finish the pot of wine. Lu Chen stood up with a smile and said to Hong Chuan, "You sit for a moment, I'll go get another pot." Hong Chuan was about to decline, but Lu Chen had already left with a smile. Hong Chuan had to sit down again. Lu Chen walked all the way to the counter, patted the table and said with a smile, "Another pot of wine, boss." Old Ma sat behind the counter and said with a smile, "Please wait a moment, I'll get it for you after I finish this bill." Lu Chen nodded and said, "Okay." He leaned against the counter and waited. He first glanced at the guests who were drinking in the tavern, and then casually glanced inside the counter. He saw Old Ma with his head down, writing on a piece of paper with a pen. There were not many words, just one line. Lu Chen's expression didn't change. He turned his head as if he didn't see anything. Then he saw Hong Chuan looking at him and said with a smile, "Wait a moment, it'll be done soon." While they were talking, Old Ma had already stood up. He smiled and took a pot of wine from the side. He handed it to Lu Chen and said, "Sir, your wine." "Okay." Lu Chen took the pot of wine and walked back to Hong Chuan with a smile and sat down. The day passed in the blink of an eye. At noon the next day, Lu Chen set off from the hut with Hong Chuan and went to Tea Mountain. The mountain breeze blew down from the top of the mountain. As far as the eye could see, everything was covered in thick green. Furthermore, the wind carried with it a refreshing fragrance that made one's heart feel at ease. This must be the unique smell of the spirit tea. The two of them walked on the mountain road one after the other. Looking at the almost omnipresent spiritual tea trees on both sides of the road, Hong Chuan couldn't help but sigh. "I didn't expect the spiritual energy here to be so good. It can grow so many spiritual tea trees." Lu Chen was walking in front. When he heard this, he turned around and said with a smile, "These are just the most common spiritual teas. I'm sure your Kunlun party wouldn't care about these." Hong Chuan laughed and said, "Because my sect has been established for a long time, we do have a lot of good things. This tea is also a little famous. If fate allows it, I will bring some for Brother Lu." Lu Chen smiled and said, "That's not bad." The two of them talked as they walked. Hong Chuan followed behind Lu Chen and found that Lu Chen seemed to be walking casually, but when it came to some forks, he almost never hesitated. Every time, he would immediately choose one of the paths. It seemed that he was very familiar with the mountain road. After walking like this for more than 2 hours, the two of them reached the top of Tea Mountain. Hong Chuan looked around and found that he was at the back of Tea Mountain at the moment. For a moment, he also felt a little emotional. He smiled and said to Lu Chen, "Fortunately, Brother Lu is leading the way. Otherwise, I would really be in trouble." Lu Chen waved his hand and said, "Last time, it was because it was late at night and dark, so you couldn't see the path clearly. If it was daytime, you might not get lost. Oh, the ghost weeping cave is over there. Let's go." The two of them continued to walk along the mountain road to the east of the mountain. When they arrived at the back of the mountain, there were not many intertwining mountain roads like in the front of the mountain. Most of the time, there was only one road. Sometimes, they couldn't even find the road and had to climb for a while to pass. However, both of them were agile people. This mountain road was not difficult for them. So after walking for about half an hour, Lu Chen suddenly stopped and then pointed to a place in front of him. He said to Hong Chuan, "It's there." Hong Chuan's spirit was lifted. He hurriedly took a few steps forward and looked ahead. He saw that in the front of the mountain, there was suddenly a big hole with a radius of more than 300 feet on the flat ground. He walked forward for a while and came to the entrance of the cave full of rocks and plants. Looking down, he saw that the bottom was actually very deep. With a rough look, it was at least 100 feet high. The surrounding cliff rock walls were extremely steep. Some pine vines and small trees grew tenaciously between the rocks, adding some vitality to this sky cavern. On the opposite rock wall further away, a stream of water flowed out from somewhere on the rock wall and suddenly fell down, forming a slender waterfall in midair. It flew straight down and fell into the bottom of the sky cavern. The mountain wind blew over, as if carrying a little moist air from there. The entire sky cavern looked quite imposing, making people feel awe. They couldn't help but sigh at the mysterious and magical nature. Hong Chuan also looked very amazed. After watching for a while, he couldn't help but say to Lu Qin, "There is such a scenery here. It is really rare." Lu Qin smiled and said, "When I first came here, the feeling was similar to you." He walked a few steps forward and came to the edge of the sky cavern. He looked down and said to Hong Chuan, "You look at the rock wall over there. Are there some nests embedded between the rocks? That is the nest of some swallows that live here. But whether it is the kind of swallows that you mentioned, I don't know." Hong Chuan nodded repeatedly and said, "That is good. That is good. I see the situation over there. It should be about the same. Now I only need to wait for these swallows to fly out to look for food. Then I will catch some more and it will be considered as completing the task that the others entrusted to me." Lu Qin said, "These swallows probably came out at dusk. I see that it is still early. Let's wait here for a while more." Hong Chuan agreed and then looked at Lu Qin. He revealed a sincere look and said, "Lu Xiong, this time you really helped me a lot. I am very grateful." Lu Qin only smiled and waved his hand to indicate that he need not be so courteous. Both of them sat on the mountain and chatted. Unknowingly, the sun was setting in the west. It was getting late. Dusk seemed to be approaching. At the same time, a strange noise was heard from below the sky cavern. It seemed that a commotion was coming over. Hong Chuan's eyes lit up. He stood up and reached into his bosom. He took out a cloth that looked very thin but full of holes. Lu Qin glanced at it. He felt that it looked like a fisherman's net. Hong Chuan turned to Lu Qin and said, "Fortunately I was careful and tied this treasure tightly to my body. Otherwise, even if we found this place, with so many agile swallows, it would be difficult for us to catch them." "Oh." Lu Qin was interested. It sounded like the strange net in Hong Chuan's hands was quite capable. He retreated to the side and observed carefully. Hong Chuan did not avoid him. He held the strange net and walked to the edge of the sky cavern. He looked down and waited silently. Chapter 23. After about half a cup of tea's time, the noise below suddenly became louder. Then, a strange chirping sound gathered together like a tide. A moment later, a black cloud suddenly flew up from the bottom of the heaven pit. Upon closer inspection, one would discover that this black cloud was actually made up of swallows that were completely black in color. Lu Qin stood to the side and looked at the swallows. After carefully identifying them for a while, he found that there was a circle of scarlet around the beak of these swallows, and on the tail feathers, there were indeed a few scarlet feathers among the black feathers. They looked brighter and more beautiful than the black feathers around them. They seemed to be the red-beaked scarlet swallows that Hong Chuan had mentioned before. At this moment, Hong Chuan, who was standing at the edge of the heaven pit, could see the appearance of these swallows even more clearly. Suddenly, a look of joy appeared on his face. Then, he muttered something and suddenly shook his hands. He spread them out and the thin net opened up with a "hoo" sound. It flew into the air and flew into the group of swallows. Only a burst of shouting and the group of swallows was suddenly in chaos. The strange net's mesh was neither too big nor too small, just enough to catch these swallows. At the same time, a strange glimmer appeared on the strange net. It actually surrounded the swallows in mid-air and covered all of them. Then, it flew back to Hong Chuan's hand. This trip and return was really magical. This kind of method was clearly a magic treasure of the legendary immortal sections. Lu Chen stood at the side and looked at this scene with a trace of a smile on his face. His gaze moved to Hong Chuan, who was standing at the edge of the heaven pit, and stared deeply at him. Hong Chuan was standing at the edge of the heaven pit. Not far from his feet was a cliff, but he didn't seem afraid at all. His eyes were only looking at the strange net in midair. He stretched out his arm and caught the net that flew back to him. He looked inside and immediately beamed with joy. He turned back to Lu Chen and said with a smile, "There's no mistake. It's the red-beaked scarlet swallow." Lu Chen smiled and nodded, "As long as it's right." He then asked curiously, "Oh yes, I remember that the swallows here aren't considered spirit beasts. Why did you catch them?" Hong Chuan reached into the net and grabbed a swallow. Then, he looked directly at the tail feather. After carefully looking at it, he pulled out a red feather from the feathers. Then, he loosened his fingers and let the swallow fly. Holding the scarlet feather in his hand, he smiled at Lu Chen and said, "This is it." Although the red-billed scarlet-feathered swallow was not a spirit beast, the scarlet feathers on its tail were quite beautiful. Especially if one was not afraid of trouble, they could weave these feathers into a shawl, which was also very beautiful. "There's a senior in my sect who likes this thing, so I specifically found this place to search for Qiyu as a token of filial piety to her." "I see." Lu Chen suddenly understood. He thought to himself, no wonder Hong Chuan is so interested in these inconspicuous swallows. It turns out that it's all for the sake of flattery. It's all out of filial piety. After understanding the whole story, Lu Chen was not in a hurry. He simply found a rock on the side and sat down, watching Hong Chuan use the strange net to catch these swallows. The strange net was very strange, but it was quite useful. Every time Hong Chuan used it, he almost never missed, so he quickly caught a lot of swallows. However, in the process, Lu Chen quickly discovered that Hong Chuan's requirements for the scarlet feather were quite high. He almost didn't want the ordinary ones, the flawed ones, the ones with dim luster, or the ones with missing tail feathers. Basically, he only chose the scarlet feather that looked perfect. As a result, the speed at which he collected the scarlet feather slowed down a lot. Every time Hong Chuan checked the tail feathers, he didn't kill them, but released the swallows. He seemed to be a kind person. Lu Chen waited for a while. Seeing that Hong Chuan had collected about a dozen beautiful scarlet feathers, he couldn't help but ask, "How many feathers do you want in total?" Hong Chuan said without hesitation, "At least 100. Lu Chen replied with an, "Oh," and said, "Take your time then." Hong Chuan turned his head and grinned at him, then turned back to catch the swallows. Just like that, they stayed on the edge of the sinkhole, and the place where the swallows looked for food seemed to be on this mountain top. A dark mass of swallows flew everywhere. After about half an hour, Hong Chuan finally almost completed the task. He counted the collected scarlet feathers again. There were a total of 98, so he smiled and said to Lu Chen, "One more net will be enough." Lu Chen smiled and nodded, and Hong Chuan stood at the edge of the sinkhole, ready to catch again. Who knew that at this time, perhaps because of the passage of time, the sky had already darkened, and many of those swallows had already returned to their nests. The number of swallows still flying in the sky had decreased, and they looked sparse. Hong Chuan's net seemed to be unable to catch more than a few, and at the same time, more swallows were flying into the sinkhole, chirping as they flew towards the steep rock wall. Hong Chuan looked a little anxious, and waited for a moment with his eyes wide open. Suddenly he saw a small group of swallows flapping their wings and flying over. There were about a dozen of them, and they also flew into the sinkhole. Hong Chuan was shocked, and when he looked again, there were almost no swallows left in the sky. In a hurry, he hurriedly took a step forward and threw the net in his hand towards the last small group of swallows. The strange net glimmered. It was indeed a magic weapon of the immortals, and it accurately covered those swallows, and then flew back. Hong Chuan was overjoyed, and leaned forward to reach out to catch it, but at this time, he suddenly heard Lu Chen's exclamation behind him, shouting, "Watch your feet." Hong Chuan's heart jumped, and subconsciously looked down, but before he could react, his body slanted, and he lost his balance, and fell down. It turned out that he was already standing not far from the edge of the cliff, and just now the last net was a little hasty, and for a moment he forgot the situation under his feet. He actually stepped on empty air, and immediately slipped and fell down. This time Hong Chuan was shocked, and cried out involuntarily, and at the same time his hands and feet flailed, desperately trying to grab those rocks and grass on the cliff to maintain his balance. But this sudden fall, the momentum was not small, those rocks and grass were all broken, and he actually could not hold on, and his entire body still fell down uncontrollably. At this critical moment, suddenly a figure pounced over from above. In a flash, he suddenly stretched out his hand, and grabbed Hong Chuan's hand, and pulled his body. Hong Chuan's falling momentum suddenly stopped, and at this time his entire body was suspended in the air, and only his right hand was grabbed by Lu Chen, who had just pounced to the edge of the cliff. The mountain breeze blew over, and both of their faces became incomparably pale. Obviously they were frightened. Chapter 24. Hong Chuan subconsciously looked down and saw that the bottom of the sinkhole was dark, like a bottomless abyss. If he fell in, even if he had cultivation experience, he would only end up with his body broken into pieces. At this moment, Hong Chuan felt all the hairs on his body stand on end. He raised his head to glance at Lu Chen, and his eyes were filled with pleading and panic. Compared to Hong Chuan's panic, Lu Chen seemed to be calmer. However, his expression didn't look good either. His face was even slightly distorted, probably because he used too much force. No matter who it was, using one hand to grab such a big living person, it was not an easy task. He leaned on the edge of the cliff, took a deep breath and then whispered to Hong Chuan below, "Don't move. I will pull you up." Hong Chuan's face was pale, looked like he could not even speak properly, only nodded his head. Lu Chen gritted his teeth and let out a muffled groan. He began to exert his strength to pull Hong Chuan up. Not to mention, his strength didn't seem to be weak. He actually managed to slowly pull Hong Chuan up a little. As his body slowly rose, Hong Chuan's face revealed a trace of joy, seeing that the edge of the cliff was getting closer and closer. A protruding rock was in front of him. Hong Chuan instinctively stretched out his hand to grab that rock, but at this moment, suddenly a gust of fierce mountain wind blew over. Hong Chuan's body suddenly swayed uncontrollably. Lu Chen's arms swayed a little, only felt that it was extremely strenuous for a while. He immediately panicked, growled from above, "Don't move." Hong Chuan was startled, shouted, "I didn't move, I didn't." Before he finished his words, suddenly a crashing sound was heard. The rock that he was grabbing crumbled again, falling down. Hong Chuan's body suddenly sank, and he immediately fell down. He even pulled Lu Chen with him as he fell down as well. Lu Chen was shocked. Just when he wanted to grab the rocks and trees beside him to stabilize his body, the falling force was too strong. He was also brought down, falling down the cliff. A strange crashing sound was heard. Gravel fell from the cliff everywhere. The two of them fell from the edge of the cliff. Fortunately, after the delay, they were still beside the cliff. At this critical moment, both of them desperately grabbed at the cliff, pine and cypress grass roots, protruding rocks, whatever they could grab, but they still kept sliding down, and the speed was getting faster and faster. Right. Almost in despair, Hong Chuan suddenly heard Lu Chen's shout beside him. He looked down to the right while falling, saw that on the cliff, about 5 or 6 zhongs below, there was a dark cave. Hong Chuan was not stupid. He immediately reacted. At this moment, the cave seemed to be their only chance of survival. He immediately screamed and used both his hands and feet to grab the hard cliff. His palms felt a sharp pain. He didn't know how many wounds he had made, but he didn't care about that. But because of this, his falling speed slowed. Seeing that the cave was in front of him, Hong Chuan let out a low roar, using all his strength to throw himself at the cave. There were a few trees growing near the cave. His body suddenly smashed heavily on the tree trunk, only to hear a bang sound. A tree trunk near the mouth of the cave snapped in the middle. But Hong Chuan's body suddenly shook, bounced up from the air, and fell at the cave entrance. At this critical moment, Hong Chuan's body hadn't even stabilized when he heard the whistling sound of wind. A figure also fell from the side. Hong Chuan yelled and pounced over, grabbing the falling Lu Chen with both hands. With all his might, he roared angrily, turned around, and threw his body into the cave. Woo-woo sound was ear-piercing, followed by another muffled sound. Lu Chen's body heavily fell on the stone wall of the cave entrance, accompanied by a muffled sound. He rolled on the ground twice. And Hong Chuan's body violently rotated twice, looked like he was about to fall out of the cave entrance. At that moment, under his feet was only an inch away from the cliff. Hong Chuan's face was scared white. Fortunately, the trees at the entrance of the cave that did not seem to be very thick once again saved his life. In a panic, Hong Chuan waved his arms and grabbed onto one of the tree trunks. Only a rustling sound could be heard and countless leaves fell. However, his body trembled and swayed countless times before he finally stabilized himself at the entrance of the cave. For a long time, the cave under the cliff was silent, only two people who were still in a state of shock, leaning against the stone wall of the cave entrance, panting heavily. When the two people's panting gradually calmed down, they raised their heads at the cave entrance and looked at each other. The expression on their faces looked a little strange. After a moment, Hong Chuan let out a dry laugh, stood up, and deeply bowed to Lu Chen, said, "Brother Lu, I am really sorry. I have implicated you again." Lu Chen also shook his head with a bitter smile, then immediately waved his hand and said, "Forget it, just now you also risked your life to save me once, let's consider it a draw." Hong Chuan's face was full of regret, looking a little embarrassed, as if for a moment he did not know what to say. Lu Chen, on the other hand, seemed to be more open-minded than him. After resting in place for a while, his expression returned to normal. He looked around the cave entrance and suddenly exclaimed, These two trees seem to be gold Siamese? Hong Chuan, who was looking awkwardly at the side, was startled when he heard this, and seemed to be surprised. The gold thread phoebe was not an ordinary tree species. There were spiritual patterns on the tree body. It was an authentic spiritual tree. Its leaves, buds, and roots were all useful spiritual materials in the Daoist sects, but the most precious thing was the trunk of this tree. It was tough and hard. It was of great use. Hong Chuan took 2 steps forward and came to the cave entrance with the 2 trees growing. At this moment, although the sky was a little dark, there was still some light at the cave entrance. He carefully looked at the 2 trees, including the one he had smashed before, then nodded to Lu Chen and said, "Brother Lu has a good eye. These 3 are really gold thread phoebe, but it is a pity that they do not seem to be old. The trunk is a little thin. It cannot be used as a big material." Lu Chen walked over and patted the trunk of one of the gold thread phoebe trees, and said with a smile, "This is already not bad, okay? Although it is only as thick as the mouth of a bull, this place is not a blessed enclave, or a place full of spiritual power like the Spirited Mountain. Just to grow like this, it would take at least 100 years. That's true." Hong Chuan sighed, then pondered for a moment and said, "Brother Lu, it is useless for me to take back such a gold thread phoebe. It is better for you to handle it." Chapter 25. Lu Chen shook his head with a smile and said, "The spirit tree has not matured yet. Even if it was cut down, it would only be worth a few spirit stones. What a pity. Forget it, let it stay here for a few more days." Hong Chuan was slightly surprised. After looking at him, he nodded. After the 2 of them rested for a while, they began to try to find a way out. Just now, they had accidentally fallen down from the cliff. At this moment, the cave entrance was at least 20 feet away from the cliff. The middle was almost all rock walls. It would be very difficult to climb up. After looking around for a while, the 2 of them could only turn back to look at the cave. Needless to say, with just a glance, he discovered that this seemingly small cave was actually a completely different world. Lu Chen pulled a few pieces of mountain wood and lit them with a match. Then, he and Hong Chuan walked into the cave. After going around a few rocks, they saw a small winding path in front of them. It actually extended forward into the mountain. The 2 of them looked at each other. After a while, Lu Chen said, "Let's go. Otherwise, we'll just be waiting for death here." Hong Chuan agreed, and the 2 of them walked forward. As they went deeper, the depths of the cave were soon plunged into darkness. The torches illuminated the nearby stone walls, and they could see many sharp stone edges and rocks. As they went further, water droplets began to drip from the stone walls. Some places were covered in moss, and occasionally, they could see some small insects crawling about in the light of the fire. The surroundings were very quiet. There was almost no sound. Soon, the passage became so narrow that only one person could walk. Lu Chen looked around and said to Hong Chuan behind him, "It seems like no one has been here before." Hong Chuan nodded. There was some worry in his eyes. He said, "I don't know if we can get out of here." Lu Chen said, "It depends on luck." After saying that, he turned around and continued walking forward. At the same time, perhaps to liven up the atmosphere and make the two more relaxed, he even said with a smile, "I remember when I was young, I often heard stories told in some tea houses and taverns. Every time there was a crisis like this, the bad guys would be unlucky, while the good guys would turn misfortune into fortune, or even gain fortune from misfortune. For example, they would suddenly see some immortal's cave, or obtain some peerless opportunity." Haha. Hong Chuan's face was originally solemn and serious. However, after hearing these words, he could not help but laugh. He shook his head and said with a smile, "Now that you mention it, it seems to be true." After a pause, he smiled and said, "I just don't know if we're the good guys or the bad guys." Lu Chen smiled and said, "Yeah, who knows?" In life, it was easy to say good guys and bad guys, but in fact, it was not necessarily that easy to distinguish. And at this moment, in this sky cavern in the wilderness, in terms of luck alone, the good or bad of Lu Chen and Hong Chuan did not seem to be very clear. They walked for a long distance. They felt that they had walked in this strange and natural mountain path for a long time, but they actually did not reach the end. During this process, they were quite lucky that they didn't encounter any accidents. But similarly, there weren't any immortals' abodes, peerless Tao techniques, divine ability manuals, or powerful fortuitous encounters that suddenly fell from the sky in front of them. From this point, it seemed that these two people were neither good nor bad. "I think I'm a good guy," Hong Chuan, who was walking at the back, said with some difficulty and panting. After walking in this dark and narrow mountain path for a long time, he still felt a little tired. Moreover, the surrounding was too dark and too quiet, which always made people feel a little strange. Therefore, he wanted to talk to Lu Chen. "You see, after walking for so long, nothing happened to us, so it must be okay." The torch in Lu Chen's hand was almost burned out. He looked at the last bit of burning flame with some worry and said at the same time, "Is that so? You can't decide who is good or bad by yourself. When you were in the Kunlun party, what did your fellow disciples think of you? Were you good or bad?" Hong Chuan thought for a while and said with some uncertainty, It seems that no one really said that before, no matter good or bad. Who would say others are good or bad for no reason?" Lu Chen smiled and said, "Is there not even one person who said it?" Hong Chuan shook his head and said, "No." Lu Chen said, "Then in your heart, have you ever thought about who is good and who is bad?" Hong Chuan was startled and said, "I think it should be us righteous people who cultivate the celestial way and uphold justice, are good people. Those evil people who kill innocent people indiscriminately, are bad people." Lu Chen's body paused for a while, as if he wanted to say something, but for some reason, he stopped. Hong Chuan followed behind him. Seeing him stop, he also stopped behind him and said, "Brother Lu, what's wrong?" Lu Chen turned around and looked at Hong Chuan. When he opened his mouth and seemed to want to say something, suddenly, the two people's eyes suddenly darkened. The torch had burned to the end, the last bit of flame was also extinguished. The cave in the belly of the mountain was suddenly plunged into darkness. Both of them fell silent. Darkness surged in from all directions in an instant. Silence reigned all around. Not knowing when it started, in the silence that seemed to be able to hear the heartbeat, Lu Chen's calm voice suddenly sounded, "Let's continue walking." Hong Chuan was shocked, because at this time, he could hardly see Lu Chen's figure in front of him, let alone continue walking. He couldn't help but ask, "It's so dark, can you see the road? If only there was a torch." Lu Chen slowly turned around, walked forward and said, "Let's go." Hong Chuan hesitated for a moment, but still slowly groped his way forward. But in that instant, he seemed to suddenly see a blurry figure in front of him in the darkness. It seemed to be Lu Chen's back. The strange thing was, when he saw Lu Chen walking, that posture was still the same as before. One of his hands was still holding the torch, as if there was still light guiding him forward. But it was clearly dark all around, there was not the slightest bit of light. That blurry figure was still walking forward, his hand was still held, as if there was really a fire burning. Silently burning, even the fire seemed to be black flames. In the legends, whenever such a situation was encountered, there would often be a major event, or a fortuitous encounter, or an encounter with a hermit expert, or a rare treasure. In short, the critical moment to test whether a person really had great luck to become the main character of fate had arrived. Chapter 26. Their journey was bumpy, but fortunately, they were able to walk out of the mountain safely. If it was a dead end, the two of them really wouldn't know what to do. Standing on the mountain, the cold mountain wind blew over their bodies. When they looked up at the sky, they found that the moon tonight was exceptionally bright. The two of them looked at each other and sighed in relief at the same time. Lu Chen smiled and said, "Our luck is not bad." Hong Chuan nodded repeatedly and said, Yes, I didn't expect to be able to walk out like this." Lu Chen looked around and found that this exit, from the outside, was just a crack in the mountain wall covered by a forest. It looked a little dark on normal days. If one didn't go in, they wouldn't know how deep it was. There were many similar stone cracks on T Mountain. Ordinary people wouldn't be able to identify them. They didn't expect that behind this crack, there was such a natural secret passage that passed through the mountain and led to the cave on the stone wall of the sky pit. Lu Chen memorized the surrounding terrain of the cave. After a moment, he smiled and said to Hong Chuan, "No matter what, we are finally out of danger. Let's go back now." Hong Chuan nodded, and then his face was a little surprised. He said, "Brother Lu, can I trouble you again? The net that I used to catch the swallows is on the ground beside the sky pit. I need to go back and get it." Lu Chen smiled and nodded. "Let's go." The two of them turned back and walked up T Mountain. When they arrived at this area, there were actually no people here. The mountain forest was dense and full of thistles and thorns. The rocks were steep and there were no roads. So the two of them walked much harder than when they came from the mountain. But fortunately, the two of them were young and strong. They used their hands and feet to climb over. About an hour later, the two of them returned to the top of the sky pit. Hong Chuan's eyes were sharp. At a glance, he saw that on the ground at the edge of the sky pit's cliff, the net was indeed thrown on the ground. At the same time, it squirmed a few times. The swallows that were just caught were still inside. Hong Chuan was overjoyed and hurriedly ran over to pick it up. Then, he and Lu Chen retreated further away from the sinkhole and inspected the swallows in the net one by one. Not long after, they found another 4 scarlet feathers in good condition. In this way, in addition to the 98 scarlet feathers he had obtained earlier, this mission had been completed, and he had even obtained 2 more feathers. Hong Chuan let out a long sigh. Lu Chen, who was beside him, smiled and patted him on the shoulder. "Congratulations." Hong Chuan turned around and said sincerely, "I'm indebted to Brother Lu for helping me so many times this time. I'm truly grateful." Lu Chen waved his hand and said with a smile, "It's nothing. Come, since it's done, let's go back." As he spoke, he led the way back. Although it was already late at night, the moonlight was bright, and the roads on the T Mountain were more or less visible. In addition, Lu Chen was very familiar with this place, so the two of them did not encounter any obstacles or dangers along the way. Just like that, they safely walked down the T Mountain and returned to Lu Chen's straw hut. Then, the two of them rested separately. In the blink of an eye, it was the second day. When the sun rose and the sunlight drove away the coldness of the night, the sound of chickens crowing and dogs barking could be heard from afar in Qingshideng village. A few wisps of smoke curled up from the chimneys. It was a peaceful and tranquil scene. Outside the straw hut at the foot of the tea mountain, Lu Qin sent Hong Chuan, who was dressed properly, out. At the same time, he asked him, "Brother Hong, you really don't need anything else? The things you brought previously have all fallen into the water and disappeared." Hong Chuan shook his head and said, "Those are just worldly possessions, it won't be a problem." As he spoke, his expression turned serious, and he looked at Lu Qin and said, "Brother Lu, you have a noble character, which I, Hong Chuan, have rarely seen in my life. My master used to teach me that it is difficult to distinguish between good and bad people in the world, but one cannot be judged by one's cultivation level. Seeing it today, I finally know that it is the truth." Lu Qin laughed and said, "Brother Hong, you are flattering me. I only helped a little, don't take it to heart." Hong Chuan shook his head and said, "Not at all. This is not a small matter to me, and even if it is a small matter, Brother Lu acted bravely for a just cause and helped out righteously. Last night before I fell asleep, I asked myself, if I was Brother Lu, would I be able to do the same? But after thinking about it again and again, I did not dare to say the word yes with certainty. I am really ashamed." Lu Qin was startled, and the smile on his face disappeared. He looked at Hong Chuan with a rare respect and said, "Brother Hong, you are too strict with yourself." Hong Chuan smiled and looked at Lu Qin. He said, "Brother Lu, you have indeed helped me a lot this time. In addition to that accident on the mountain last night, you even saved my life. I really do not know how to repay such a great kindness." Lu Qin smiled and shook his head. Just as he was about to say something, Hong Chuan said, "Brother Lu, let me be bold and ask one more thing. You have lived in this Qingshidang village for so many years. Is it also because of the opportunity to go to the nearby thousand-year sect to check your innate talent and see if there is a chance for you to cultivate?" Lu Qin raised his eyebrows slightly, and a faint glimmer flashed across his eyes, but he quickly returned to normal. After a moment of silence, he smiled and said, "More or less. Look at the people living in this village, who doesn't do it for this reason?" Hong Chuan nodded. After a moment of silence, he took a jade pendant from the hilt of the sword behind him and passed it to Lu Qin. Lu Qin was slightly stunned. He reached out to take the jade pendant and felt a slight coolness to his hand. The jade pendant was about an inch square and had a warm luster. There were no words on it, only a picture of a river was carved on it. "This is..." Lu Qin raised his head and asked Hong Chuan with a puzzled look on his face. Hong Chuan took a deep breath and said sternly, "Brother Lu, this jade pendant is my personal keepsake. Keep it well. Although I don't know what kind of opportunities you will encounter in the future, if you are not satisfied, you can bring this item to Kunlun Mountain to find me. I dare not say anything else, but I will definitely ask for a chance to test your innate aptitude. If you're fortunate enough to have good fortune and fated chance, you'll be able to enter my Kunlun sect as your body's root bone. If you don't have talent and fated chance, I can also guarantee that you'll be a part-time disciple in Kunlun sect. I don't dare to say what your future will be like, but you'll be better than an ordinary person." Lu Qin's body shook slightly, and his face showed some surprise. Then his eyes flashed as if he thought of something. His expression changed a few times. After a moment, he nodded heavily and said, "I didn't expect Brother Hong to be so generous and righteous. I understand, I will accept this gift." Hong Chuan laughed and cupped his hands at Lu Qin. Without saying much, he turned around and strode away. Soon, he went down the foot of the mountain and walked further and further away on the bluestone road beside the clear water stream. Soon, his figure disappeared among the clusters of green bamboos and peach blossoms. Lu Qin, who was standing in front of the hut, looked up at the sky. He saw that the sky was blue and the sky was clear. For some reason, a smile slowly appeared at the corner of his mouth. Chapter 27. A chance to enter the Kunlun party and cultivate? In the tavern, the plump old ma sat at a table by the window. His stubby fingers caressed the jade pendant in his hand. After a while, he looked at Lu Qin with a strange expression. Lu Qin, who sat across from him, tilted his head back and drank a glass of wine. He shrugged and said, "At least that's what he said." Old Ma snorted and stared at Lu Chen. Don't play dumb in front of me. I don't believe you can't hear the strangeness in those words. Lu Chen smiled but didn't say anything. Old Ma ignored him and continued, saying, everything in this world is the same. Look at the mortals in Qingshitang village. They spend most of their lives working hard for an illusory chance. How can this kind of chance be so easily obtained? Lu Chen said, maybe Hongchuan is a disciple of a famous sect, so it's not too difficult for him to get a chance to examine one's foundation. Old Ma sneered and said, that's the Kunlun party, one of the top sects in Zhengxianmeng. Although it's no longer at its peak, a starving camel is still bigger than a horse. No matter what, it's not something a useless sect like the Thousand Autumns sect can compare to. Do you believe that the leader of the Thousand Autumns sect has to personally welcome a foundation establishment disciple of the Kunlun party? Lu Chen smiled and said, you're looking down on the Thousand Autumns sect too much. Old Ma sneered and looked as if he was clearly looking down on that stupid sect. Then, he suddenly paused and looked at Lu Chen. Speaking of which, what's that guy's cultivation level? If he's a foundation establishment disciple, he's an elite of the Kunlun party. It's reasonable for him to give you a chance to examine your foundation. Lu Chen frowned and said, Hongchuan's foundation is very solid, but his cultivation level isn't too high. He should still be in the Qi cultivation realm and hasn't broken through to the foundation establishment realm. Old Ma shook his head and said, that shouldn't be the case. Kunlun sect is such a famous sect with so many disciples. If it's just the most ordinary disciple in the Qi refining realm, no matter what, he wouldn't have such a big face. Unless there's someone behind him, well, an elder with a very high status in the sect, or he simply has a highly respected master. Lu Chen thought and smiled. That seems to be true. Other than this opportunity, he also said that even if I don't have any talent, he can guarantee that I'll be a servant disciple of the Kunlun party. This is definitely something that only those with connections in the Kunlun party have. Pa! Old Ma suddenly slammed the table with an indignant expression and said angrily, damn it. It's always you guys who secretly teach each other all day long. That's why talented people like me, who don't have any background, can't achieve their ambitions. Lu Chen coughed and reminded him, I haven't gone to the Kunlun party yet. How could I secretly teach each other? Old Ma snorted and looked at him. You're all jackals of the same tribe anyway. Lu Chen laughed and then raised his head to drink another glass of wine. He then smiled and said, I won't go anyway. Old Ma was stunned for a moment, and then an unnatural expression flashed across his face. He sighed and said, it's a pity that you had such a good talent back then, but it was destroyed by the vicious black flame curse. Lu Chen's eyes drooped slightly, and then he smiled. He stood up and walked to Old Ma's side. He patted his thick shoulder and said with a smile, it doesn't matter. Anyway, I've lived a mortal's life for 10 years. I'm used to it now. Old Ma wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Lu Chen stretched himself and took the jade pendant from Old Ma's hand and put it back into his arms. Then, he walked towards the door and said with a smile, I was tired last night. I'm going back to catch up on sleep today. Old Ma didn't get up to see him off. He just silently watched the man walk out of the tavern and gradually go away alone. Looking from afar, he always felt that his back seemed a little lonely. The weather was sunny, and Qingshitang village became lively. Miss Dingdang, who usually liked to sleep in, woke up early again today. She was dressed neatly, and her face was pretty. Walking through the village, she attracted many glances. Some were envious, some were infatuated, some were greedy, and some were jealous. However, she didn't care. She had seen these kinds of looks many times. At least in this village, she wasn't afraid. Even though 1,000 spirit stones was a large amount, it was no longer an unreachable amount. As long as she was lucky in the future, she would be able to gain the favor of the elders of the Thousand Autumn sect. Humph. These stinky men in the village, those stingy wretches who wanted to strip her naked with their eyes, and those hypocritical and jealous women, they were all ants under her feet. Thinking up to here, she couldn't help but feel a little light-hearted. The corner of her mouth revealed a trace of a smile as she looked at the surrounding village with disdain. Then, in her heart, she couldn't help but think, when the time comes, you guys will all kneel on the ground and beg me. But, I definitely won't purify you guys. And, young Masterly on the other side of the river is not bad. He looks quite pleasing to the eye. When the time comes, I can purify him. Also, Lu Chen, even though he's a lecherous, vulgar, and careless person who takes advantage of others every day, his personality is actually not bad. When the time comes, I'll purify him. Ding Dong's heart was filled with happiness. Suddenly, her eyes lit up as she saw Lu Chen walking over from a fork in the road in front of her. She stopped in her tracks and raised her hand to wave at him. She thought to herself, stinky man, I'm in a good mood today. Hurry up and tell me a few jokes to amuse me. In the future, I'll purify you. Who knew that today, Lu Chen seemed to have some thoughts in his mind. His eyes were always looking forward, and his face seemed to be deep in thought as he walked past. He actually didn't notice Ding Dong's greeting and just walked past her. Ding Dong was stunned for a moment, and immediately felt a burst of anger. She stared hatefully at Lu Chen's back and clenched her teeth. She thought to herself, this stinky man is indeed useless. When I become an immortal in the future, no matter how much you beg me or kneel in front of me, I won't purify you. She turned her head and raised her chin like a proud peacock. She didn't look at Lu Chen anymore, but just happened to see that on the other side of Qingshui Creek, there was a group of women surrounding them. In the middle of the group, there was a handsome man standing with a smile. If it wasn't young Master Li Ji, who else could it be? Ding Dong's heart jumped. She couldn't be bothered with Lu Chen anymore. She lifted her dress and hurriedly walked towards the other side of Qingshui Creek. Chapter 28. Of course, Lu Chen, who was walking on the bluestone path, didn't know that in that instant, without any warning, without doing anything, he had already been removed from the mind of a certain woman who could possibly become an immortal in the future as a possibility of grooming him. But if he knew, he would probably smile wryly. He walked calmly on the bluestone path. He walked past the large locust tree, glanced at old Yu, who was fishing, and left the bustling crowd behind him. Then, he walked toward the lonely thatched hut at the foot of the mountain that was gradually deserted. He opened the door, walked in, and closed it again. The inside and outside of the door seemed to be separated from the outside. An unremarkable stalk of grass floated down from the sky, slid in front of him, and slowly fell to the ground. Lu Chen looked at the stalk of grass. A trace of fatigue slowly appeared in his eyes. Then, he walked over to the bed and lay down. He lay there quietly. After a while, he closed his eyes. His vision darkened, but then light shone again. He seemed to see lofty mountains, thousands of rivers, and a vast expanse in the distance, like an ocean. These illusions were what he saw when he immersed his divine sense into his body. To most mortals, this was a very strange and miraculous ability. Only cultivators who had cultivated the immortal Tao could possess this ability. With this divine sense that could peer into one's meridians and qi, one could observe the condition of one's body, including the 5 elements divine disk in one's qi, which most mortals yearned for. In other words, one didn't need magic treasures like the immortal mirror to see if one had the aptitude to cultivate. However, this seemed to be a paradox. This kind of divine sense could only be possessed by cultivators who had cultivated the immortal Tao, but those who hadn't cultivated before wouldn't have this kind of divine sense and thus wouldn't be able to see one's aptitude. Thus, mortals toiled their entire lives and paid countless spirit stones just for this pitiful opportunity. It was a pair of eyes in the unseen world. They crossed the mountains and rivers, flying forward and soon arrived at the ocean. On the path of cultivation, this was the manifestation of the qi, the foundation of cultivation. Every cultivator had a 5 elements divine disk in their qi, and on it were divine pillars that occupied the positions of the 5 elements. Metal, wood, water, fire, and earth were all different, but no matter who it was, if they wanted to cultivate, they had to have at least one pillar. With the fire pillar, one could practice the fire cultivation method. With the water pillar, one could practice the water cultivation method. With more 5 elements divine pillars, the range of cultivation method could be expanded accordingly. This was the fundamental principle of the human cultivation world for thousands of years. As for the strength of one's innate talent, it depended on the luster of the 5 elements divine pillars. They were all different, so he would talk about them in the future. At this moment, Lu Chen looked out and saw the clouds moving away and the wind blowing. Suddenly, everything was gone, leaving only an object rising up from the depths of the energy sea. It was the 5 elements godly disk. However, it was different from the dazzling godly disk of ordinary people. The godly disk in his body was charred black, withered and cracked in many places, and there was not a single divine pillar on the godly disk. Between those terrifying cracks, between the collapsed remains of the divine pillars, he could still see clusters and clusters of flames silently burning, and tearing. They were like demons in hell, glaring at him with incomparable fierceness, using the most vicious curse to burn his soul, never to stop. His eyes were indifferent and expressionless. He just looked at the godly disk that was covered with cuts and bruises, and on the godly disk that symbolized the foundation of all cultivation, there was a continuous burning flame. That was a black flame that used his soul as fuel. It looked like it was entangled with him forever, and it would not stop until he died. Day after day passed. The affairs of the world were like the surface of the Dragon Lake, always calm and unperturbed. Everything went according to plan, and everything seemed to be peaceful. The only change was the newcomer, Li Ji. He was getting more and more liked by the girls in the village. His paintings were really beautiful, especially the court ladies. They were vivid and lifelike, so much so that people felt that they were even more beautiful than real people. Moreover, he was really very handsome. So the girls in the village flocked to him, pestering him all day, begging him to paint for them. Ding Dang was no exception. These days, she squeezed until her head was broken, and she was thick-skinned, waking up early and returning late. She was not afraid of other people laughing at her or gossiping, and she actually made Li Ji paint for her twice. Adding the first time, it was 3 paintings. 3 paintings, all of them were of her. One painting was Summer Night leaning on the window and gazing at the moon, another was Spring Wind Peach Forest admiring flowers, and the last was Palace Dress Girl chasing fireflies. 3 paintings, each of them were exquisite, each of them were beauties, as if condensed into the most beautiful moments of a girl's life, each beautiful figure reflected on the paper. Ding Dang loved these paintings. She carefully framed them and hung them in her room, on the same white wall. She would often stare at them in a daze, occasionally blushing, and often smiling. On this day, she was once again looking at the paintings of beauties on the wall. Her eyes were slightly intoxicated. Suddenly she heard someone knocking on the door, causing Ding Dang to wake up. She walked out and shouted, "Who is it?" before opening the door. There was a figure standing outside the door, laughing at her, revealing his white and neat teeth. Ding Dang was startled, and said, "Why is it you?" Lu Chen smiled as he walked past her, walked into the courtyard, looked around, and then said with a smile, "You speak like you are treating me as an outsider. In the entire Qingshitang village, I am probably the one who comes to your house the most." Ding Dong's face slightly reddened, and she smacked him, then closed the door, walked over, and said, "Glib tongue, why can't you change?" Lu Chen laughed, stood beside her, and then reached out to her shoulder, pulling Ding Dang into his embrace, and said, "Everyone is so familiar with each other, there is no need to put on an act." Ding Dang spat out a sentence, pushed him away, and took 2 steps to the side, but she did not seem to be angry, only pouting and sighing, and said, "I don't like it anymore." Lu Chen was startled, and the smile on his face disappeared. He frowned and thought for a moment, and said with some doubt, "Did I say something wrong, or did I offend you?" Ding Dang shook her head. Lu Chen shrugged his shoulders, since he did not do anything wrong, then there was nothing to worry about. His smile once again returned to his face, and then he walked over and stuffed 2 things into Ding Dong's hands, and said, "Let's go, let's enter the house." Chapter 29. Ding Dang did not know why, but her heart suddenly jumped. She lowered her head to look at her palm, where there were two beautiful and bright spirit stones. The beautiful light refracted in midair, and it looked as if there was a faint rainbow light lingering around the spirit stone, adding a bit of temptation to it. Lu Chen smiled and pulled Ding Dang. Ding Dang lowered her head, hesitated for a moment, then slowly walked forward, following him into the house. The spring wind was as gentle as a lover's hand, lightly blowing through the mountains and villages. The grass and flowers in the courtyard slightly trembled, and on the petals there were crystal-clear dewdrops. After the sound of breathing calmed down, under the soft bedding, they calmly lay on the bed. The world outside the house seemed to be separated far away, as if there were only the two of them left in the world. It was abnormally peaceful and tranquil. Ding Dang slowly sat up, using the quilt to cover the skin below her chest, and leaned against the wall beside the bed. Her face still had a bit of a captivating red, her gaze as gentle as water. Then she saw the three paintings hanging on the opposite wall. She stared at the paintings, looking at them for a long time. The expression in her eyes gradually changed. At this time, she suddenly felt something. Lowering her head to look, she discovered that the man had turned around, and was also looking at her. "Why are you looking at me?" Ding Dang asked. Lu Chen smiled, reaching out his hand to lightly caress Ding Dang's cheek, then sincerely said, "You really are a beauty." Ding Dang bit her lips, then smiled, looking a bit happy, but then she looked at the opposite wall. After a moment, she said in a low voice, "Lu Chen. I don't want to be like this in the future." Lu Chen looked at her, smiled and said, "I don't understand, don't want what?" Ding Dang took a deep breath, and said, "I don't want you to give me spirit stones, and then sleep with you." The smile on Lu Chen's face faded, but he didn't seem to be angry. He just quietly looked at Ding Dang, and after a while, said, "Are you trying to say that you don't want to sell your body for spirit stones anymore?" Ding Dang nodded and said, "Yes." Lu Chen replied with an, "Oh," and said, "Okay, I got it." After that, he got up, picked up the clothes on the side, and began to put them on. Ding Dang was still leaning on the bed, staring at him in a daze. When Lu Chen finished putting on his clothes, he turned around to look at Ding Dang, hesitated for a moment, then said, "Why is it, can you tell me?" Ding Dang silently shook her head. Lu Chen smiled and said, "But since you don't produce and don't have any other way to earn spiritual stones, what are you going to do with the remaining spiritual stones?" Ding Dang pursed her lips and said in a low voice, "I have my own ways." "All right." Lu Chen shrugged his shoulders, turned around and walked out of the door. In the middle of this, his gaze swept across the white wall, stopping on the three paintings hanging on it for a moment. Then he turned around and said to Ding Dang, "These paintings, they draw you quite beautifully." Ding Dang giggled, her snow-white shoulders were bare, and she hugged the blanket tightly to cover her chest. Then her laughter became more and more joyful, louder and louder. Finally, when Lu Chen was about to walk out of the door, he heard her shout from the bed behind him, saying, "Thank you." Lu Chen's footsteps paused for a moment, then he turned around and smiled towards the room. "No need to thank me, I also like being with you." Finished speaking, he waved his hand towards the room, then turned around and walked out with large steps. Inside the room, Ding Dang, who was sitting on the bed, stared blankly at the man's disappearing figure, slowly biting her lips. The smile on her face gradually disappeared, then she grabbed the blanket even tighter, tightly wrapping her body, as if she was feeling a little cold. There were no other customers in the tavern, so only Lu Chen and the tavern manager Old Ma sat opposite each other. Old Ma poured a cup of wine for him, then said, "Seems like there's nothing else." Lu Chen looked at him, and said, "What do you mean?" Old Ma moved his butt, letting his slightly fat body sit more comfortably, then said, "About the Three Realms demon sex diagram, I found a few suspicious people, but in the past few days, they have all been investigated, and should have nothing to do with them." Lu Chen nodded his head, picked up the wine cup in front of him and drank a mouthful. After a moment of silence, he suddenly said, "That newcomer Li Ji?" Old Ma shook his head, and said, "He has nothing to do with the demon sect, he is just a mortal." "Oh." Lu Chen responded, and for some reason, he seemed to believe Old Ma's words very much, but although his expression looked calm, there seemed to be a trace of gloominess. Old Ma did not notice this, and continued to say, but speaking of this Li Ji, recently there have been some rumors, saying that this person is not from an ordinary family, but from an aristocratic family. Originally his family was wealthy, unfortunately an accident happened, and his family fell, so he ended up here. Lu Chen's eyebrows slightly raised, looked at Old Ma, and said, aristocratic family? Old Ma laughed, and said, that's what the rumors say, probably because of this, Li Ji does not know anything else, but he is proficient in zither, chess, calligraphy, and painting. By the way, I heard that because his family was wealthy in the past, his family was on good terms with a certain cultivation sect, and one of the sect's elders once showed him the kindness to examine his talent, and it was confirmed that he has an extraordinary innate talent, and in his Qi ocean, there is not only the 5 elements disc for cultivation, but also 2 pillars of metal and water, which is a rare metal and water spirit vein. Lu Chen placed the wine cup in his hand on the table, and smiled, but did not speak, his expression thoughtful. Old Ma did not mind, and continued to say, that's why everyone in the village is saying that as long as this young masterly gathers 1,000 spiritual stones and visits the 1,000 Autumn sect with the celestial mirror, he will definitely be accepted as a disciple of the sect. Lu Chen thought for a moment, and said, so this young Master Li Ji is no ordinary person? That's right. Old Ma smiled, and said, nowadays, many people in the village are sucking up to him, especially those women, they surround him like crazy. Sigh. He's young and handsome, and he's even talented. There's nothing I can do to be envious of him. Lu Chen smiled, and pushed the wine cup forward, and said lightly, pour the wine. When the sky darkened, Lu Chen walked on the bluestone path beside Qingshui Creek, the night breeze blowing on his face, bringing a faint chill. The scenery of Qingshui Creek under the night sky was different from the scenery during the day. The reflection of the water in between the shadows of the trees was like pieces of glass that had been cut into pieces, sparkling and sparkling, reflecting every spot of light. Chapter 30. There were ripples in the wind. The bamboos swayed and the peach trees trembled. He walked to the foot of the mountain and entered the grass hut. There was no one in the grass hut, just like any other day. Lu Chen watched the gray stalk of grass slowly fall and then turned to close the door. He walked to the bed and lay down. In the darkness, the strange wailing sounds came from outside the window. He quietly lay in the darkness, letting the darkness gradually swallow his body, as if he had fallen into a deep sleep. The night deepened and the wind was like the wailing of ghosts. No one seemed to remember the lonely grass hut at the foot of the mountain. But at a certain moment in the night, suddenly, in the grass hut, in the deepest part of the darkness, there was a muffled grunt. Lu Chen's eyes suddenly widened. There was darkness in front of him, but it was like a terrifying flame was burning. Black fire. Black fire burst out from every corner of his body, like a dancing poisonous snake, wildly twisting, burning all the flesh on his body, but not damaging any of his clothes or bedding. Everything was silent, but it was as if the heavens and earth had suddenly collapsed. The miserable cry surpassed all the wails in the world. After a moment, the bed suddenly trembled, and then he disappeared. The next moment, Lu Chen landed on the ground and once again came to the mysterious tree hole-like space. Under the soft illumination of the light, the black flames had already ignited Lu Chen's entire body, turning him into a flaming man. He cried out in pain and then staggered towards the puddle of water in the center of the tree hole. Voila! Water splashed in all directions. He once again entered the dark green and abnormally lush water. Almost at the same time he entered the water, the wildly burning black fire was immediately suppressed. The fire slowly weakened and then began to shrink back into Lu Chen's body. Everything seemed to be the same as last time. The water rippled gently, and the strange life aura in this water continuously seeped into Lu Chen's body, healing the terrifying wounds caused by the black flames one by one until not a single scar could be seen. After an unknown amount of time, Lu Chen slowly sat up straight in the water. He glanced at his body and then looked at the pool of water beside him. The color of the water was light green. It swayed slightly and looked very beautiful. However, 10 years ago, when he first discovered this place, this pool of clear water was a deep green color. At that time, the vitality here was so thick that it seemed like it could be breathed. But now, it was getting thinner and thinner. As for the black fire, it seemed to be acting up more and more frequently. If the last bit of green in the water disappeared, what would be the fate that awaited him? Dripping wet, he sat in the water for a long time without getting up. His expression was indifferent as he silently pondered. This spring seemed to be slowly passing by. The weather began to heat up and the days brightened earlier and earlier. However, the spirit tea trees on the tea mountain became more and more luxuriant. Cicadas were already chirping on the big pagoda tree by Qingshui Creek. The old fisherman was still fishing under the tree. One morning, when Lu Chen woke up, he saw smoke rising from the chimneys of the village at the foot of the mountain. He was wondering if he should make up his mind today when he suddenly saw a figure walking towards his straw hut. Separated by a distance, he could tell that it was Ding Dang. After that day, he never went to find Ding Dang again, and Ding Dang naturally did not come to find him either. The two of them, who were once close and familiar, suddenly became strangers. Until today, she suddenly came to this grass hut. When the sunlight shone down, Lu Chen discovered that Ding Dang, who had just walked out of the grass hut, was slightly out of breath. Her chest was slightly heaving up and down, and her cheeks were slightly red. She was still as beautiful as ever. After seeing Lu Chen, Ding Dang smiled at him and then happily called out to him, saying, "Hey, long time no see." Lu Chen smiled and nodded, yes. Ding Dang turned her head and looked around. Looking at the tea mountain and the village at the foot of the mountain, she sighed and said, "So living at the foot of the mountain is peaceful and the scenery is good. If I had known earlier, would have also come to live here." Lu Chen laughed, "When night comes, you won't like it here." Ding Dang laughed, then looked at Lu Chen and said, "How have you been recently?" Lu Chen said, "Pretty good, how about you?" Ding Dang said, "I'm also pretty good." Lu Chen nodded and said, "That's good." Following that, they suddenly did not speak, as if they had nothing to say, but also as if they were a little embarrassed. Even if they deliberately pretended that nothing had happened, it would not help. The silence continued, the two people seemed to be at a loss. After a moment, it was Lu Chen who lightly coughed and said, "What did you come to find me for?" Ding Dang thought for a moment and said, "There is something I want to tell you." Lu Chen said, "Oh, go ahead. Can you lend me 300 spirit stones?" Ding Dang suddenly asked after a moment of silence. Lu Chen suddenly became silent and looked straight into Ding Dang's eyes. Ding Dang looked a little embarrassed, her gaze was a little flustered. She subconsciously looked away, but then seemed to think of something. She gathered her courage and turned her head to look at Lu Chen and then asked in a soft voice, "Can I?" Lu Chen did not agree, nor did he refuse. After quietly looking at Ding Dang for a while, he opened his mouth and asked, "What do you want?" Ding Dang was a little surprised at Lu Chen's unusual calmness, but she did not have the time to think about it. After taking a deep breath, her face showed some hesitation. She wanted to say something but hesitated. In the end, she still sighed and said, I have an urgent need." Saying that, she secretly looked at Lu Chen and hesitated for a moment before saying, "If this amount is too big, why don't you lend me 200 spirit stones first, is that okay?" Lu Chen was silent for a while and said, "Are you in a hurry?" Ding Dang heavily nodded and said, "Very." Then she softly said, "The people in this village are all. I really can't think of anyone else who can help me, so I came to find you." Lu Chen smiled and slightly lowered his eyes. After a while, he said, "I don't have that many spirit stones on me right now. Wait for me for a day, I'll see if I can gather them." Ding Dang was overjoyed and cheered. Then she smiled and nodded her head repeatedly. The peaceful and plain life continued. The people of Qingshetang village welcomed summer after the warm and beautiful spring. But other than the weather gradually becoming hotter and the chirping of cicadas in the trees, it seemed that the life of the village did not change much. Until the 4th day of the 6th month, a piece of news suddenly spread, causing this peaceful little village to be in an uproar. Chapter 31. For the first time in decades, an accomplished immortal master from the Thousand Autumns sect took a fancy to a young man in Qingshetang village. After the young man paid the fee and passed the mirror of immortality, the immortal master from the Thousand Autumns sect was right. This young man was gifted and was accepted as a personal disciple. When the news spread, Qingshatang village was in an uproar. Everyone spread the news. Countless people were envious and jealous. The luckiest young man was the man of the hour in the village, the suave young master Li Ji. In today's world, entering an immortal sect was like a carp leaping through the dragon's gate. From then on, one's life would be completely different. The young man who was smiling warmly and painting for the girls by the stream yesterday was now like a god standing high above the clouds, looking down on all living things. No one could get close to him anymore. As a result, the women in the village often sighed with regret. There were also people who carefully mounted their old pictures and hung them on the wall to look at them every day, treating them as memories that they could recall for the rest of their lives. As for more wishful thinking, no one really thought about it. Occasionally, when they gathered together to talk about young Master Li, they would laugh and argue that he was nicer to them back then. The weather was getting hotter and fewer people came to drink. Business in Old Ma's tavern was very bleak. Most of the time, only Lu Chen, who ate and drank for free, came to his tavern. This made Old Ma's mood not very good. In addition, he had not cultivated to the point where he was immune to heat and cold. As a fatty, it was especially easy for him to sweat on hot days, so he was a little irritated. On this day, Old Ma looked at the only customer in his tavern. He was getting more and more annoyed. He said to Lu Chen, "Hey! You already owe me a big debt, and you still have the nerve to come here and eat for free?" Lu Chen laughed and drank the wine in his glass in one gulp. Then, he leaned against the table and said to Old Ma with a smile, "Nowadays, the one who owes the debt is the boss. Don't you know?" "Bah!" Old Ma spat at him and then wiped the sweat on his forehead with the towel beside him. He walked to the table opposite Lu Chen and sat down. He looked out of the window at the village where the sun was shining brightly and sighed, "Look at the people outside. They work themselves to death from day to night. What's the point of it? Look at that Li Ji. He hasn't been here for long, but he's already in the Thousand Autumns gate. People really can't be compared." Lu Chen shook his head and said, "Aren't you being sarcastic? People who have nothing and want to cultivate are all like this." Old Ma clicked his tongue, but he did not refute Lu Chen's words. He merely shook his head and said, "That Li Ji fellow is really lucky." Lu Chen quietly looked at an unknown direction in the distance outside the window. After staring silently for a while, he turned his head and said to Old Ma, "This is just a chance for that person. There's nothing to care about. But the matter of the evil sect pattern, you still can't find any clues?" Old Ma heard this and scratched his head in distress. He bitterly smiled and said, "Yes." Lu Chen snorted and said, "That pattern can't be carved there for no reason. Something must have happened in this village. Be more careful." Old Ma sighed and said, "It's not like you don't know. I've secretly searched this village many times but I really can't find anyone suspicious. It's like I've seen a ghost. Those evildoers from the evil sect must be too bored. They just drew a pattern and ran away." Lu Chen was silent. After a while, he placed the wine cup on the table and stood up. He said, "I'm going back." By the Qingshui stream, the green bamboos were still green but the peach blossoms had already withered. It looked a little lonely. Under the blazing hot sun, there were very few people walking on the green stone path. Lu Chen walked along the side of the stream. Just as he was about to walk past the stone bridge, he suddenly saw a familiar figure walking over from the other side of the stream. It was Ding Dang. Lu Chen stopped walking. Ding Dang, who was standing on the stone bridge, also saw Lu Chen. Her face flashed a trace of astonishment. She then smiled and greeted him, but her smile was somewhat forced. The two of them walked to the shade of the green bamboos to talk. Ding Dang looked a little uneasy but she quickly smiled and said to Lu Chen, "It's been a while." Lu Chen sized her up and nodded his head, "Yes, I haven't seen you in a while. Where did you go?" Ding Dang said, "No, I'm suffering from the summer." I hate this hot weather the most, so I don't like to go out. Oh. Lu Chen nodded his head and replied. Then the two of them sank into silence. After a while, perhaps feeling a little awkward, Ding Dang pursed her lips and said, "That. I owe you spirit stones. You will have to wait a little longer. I will return it to you soon." Lu Chen said, "No worries, I don't have anything urgent." Ding Dang looked like she was relieved and her mood was much better. She actually stuck out her tongue and said with a smile, "Don't worry, I will definitely not renege on my debt. I said I will return it to you and I will definitely return it to you. Moreover, when the opportunity comes, I will also bestow you with a heavenly fortune." Heavenly fortune? Lu Chen raised his eyes and looked at Ding Dang. Ding Dang smiled sweetly and nodded her head heavily. She was in high spirits as if she already had power in her hands and the confidence to control other people's lives. Deep into the night, at the foot of Tea Mountain, the heat of the day had completely dissipated. What replaced it was a cool and refreshing cold wind that blew down from the mountain. Those strange sounds that sounded like the wailing of ghosts and the howling of wolves sounded out once again. It was like a ghost palace in hell, causing one's heart to palpitate. The grass hut at the foot of the mountain stood alone in the darkness, surrounded by the endless night. The grass hut was silent. The doors and windows were tightly shut. Although it could not block out the strange sounds, it was still like a strange little world. There was no one in the hut. In the darkness, one could not even hear the sound of breathing. One could only see a blurry shadow and an overturned bed board. In the mysterious space of the tree hole, Lu Chen sat on the ground. He looked at the light green puddle in front of him with a serious expression. He looked solemn. His eyebrows were tightly knitted as if he was deep in thought. It was as if there was something he was hesitating about. Around him, the tree hole was quiet. The gray qi wrapped around the ancient tree walls were like gentle water ripples, gently flowing and undulating. After an unknown period of time, suddenly, Lu Chen's eyes opened, as if he had finally hardened his heart and made a decision. He took a deep breath, and a strange black light flashed across his face. A moment later, there was a faint glimmer of light coming from his lower abdomen, which was the most important place for all cultivators, the Dantian and the Sea of Qi. Chapter 32. The Dantian Sea of Qi was the most vital point for all cultivators who cultivated the immortal Tao. But for Lu Chen, the terrifying black fire from 10 years ago was like a bone-piercing awl that had completely destroyed his foundation. He could neither live nor die, and he had repeatedly suffered the terrible pain of being burned by the black fire. This was also the first time in 10 years that he actively stimulated the qi in his dantian. From another point of view, this was equivalent to him actively activating the black flame curse. Sure enough, just as he tried to activate the qi in his dantian, when his completely damaged 5 elements disc trembled slightly and was about to take shape, a demonic black fire suddenly rolled up from the bottom of the disc, emerging from the depths of every hideous crack and wound, like the silent but terrifying laughter of an evil spirit. The black fire instantly spread throughout his Dantian sea of qi, and then rushed out in all directions. The black fire burned his body. Lu Chen roared in pain, and the black fire crazily penetrated through many corners of his skin. His flesh trembled, and instantly turned into terrible scorched earth. However, this time, Lu Chen didn't directly throw himself into the only light green puddle that could save him like he did in the past. With unimaginable willpower, he forcefully sat upright on the spot, forcefully enduring all of the pain. His eyes were wide open as he stared at the puddle before him. His face was reflected in the water. Like an evil spirit burning with black fire. Even his eyes seemed to be burning with black flames at this moment. Lu Chen groaned, the muscles on his face twisting, and then suddenly, in his Dantian sea of qi, the damaged 5 elements disc seemed to be activated by some kind of power, and began to slowly rotate. Every time it spun, Lu Chen's entire body seemed to tremble once. The black flames were like an enraged demon. With a loud rumble, they surged forward with incomparable ferocity, completely engulfing the damaged divine disc phantom. Everything seemed to be on the verge of being incinerated by this terrifying black fire, including his flesh, blood, and soul. The water in the nearby puddle was calm, but it was like the world's greatest temptation, quietly lying in front of Lu Chen. There were a few times when Lu Chen's body couldn't help but lean forward, wishing that he could roll into the icy cold water just like he did in the past. But for some reason, he still endured. He howled in the terrible black fire. At this moment there seemed to be not an inch of his body that was intact, and even his face looked somewhat deformed. But in the black fire, there was still a light, although weak, still flickering. That light came from his dantian, the 5 elements disc that was damaged to the extreme, burned by countless black flames. Even if it looked like it was about to collapse in the next moment, about to break into pieces and be completely destroyed, until now, this 5 elements disc was unusually tenacious. That white light still didn't extinguish. All of a sudden, all of the black flames on Lu Chen's body shrank back into his body. They traveled through his meridians like lightning and rushed back to his dantian. Like a tsunami, they crazily rushed towards the 5 elements divine disc. That place was the final foundation of Lu Chen's flesh and soul, and also the fundamental place where the black fire curse resided. As if in this silent world, suddenly there was an earth-shattering sound, and in an instant, all the black fire wrapped around the disc shone brightly, the black light engulfing everything. Lu Chen screamed in pain. In his dantian, that light dimmed, and the 5 elements disc finally couldn't resist this terrible curse, collapsing piece by piece, just like his body and soul, on the verge of dispersing. In this split second, suddenly, Lu Chen roared. His right hand suddenly turned over, a bright light appeared, and a black and incomparably sharp dagger suddenly appeared in his hand. At this moment, his face was as cold as ice, not even the slightest emotion could be seen. With a flip of his hand, he directly stabbed this black dagger into his lower abdomen. His charred abdomen split open in an instant, and he howled to the sky. Then, his left hand formed a claw, and suddenly stabbed it into his dantian. At the same time, the last of his remaining strength was frantically circulating. That badly damaged 5 elements disc trembled as it welcomed the attack. He grabbed it, as if he was holding his own heart, and slowly pulled it out. The black fire burned crazily, rolling, and was about to sweep up along his wrist, but Lu Chen suddenly sank his hand, and the next moment, his entire left hand sank into that pool of blue water. An incomparably dense life force surged over from all directions, surrounding the black flame. The black flame slowly left his palm, but it did not extinguish. It was still burning fiercely under the water, but it was gradually trapped in a wave of water. Lu Chen's body trembled violently. No one, especially a person whose physique was almost the same as an ordinary person, could withstand such a heavy injury. Right now, there was no trace of blood on his face. He slowly lowered his head, his body powerlessly fell forward. With a roll, he also fell into that pool of blue water. With a hwala sound, a splash of water slowly fell down. Then, everything returned to tranquility, and there was no longer any sound. It was quiet in the tree hole, as if time had stopped here. One could faintly see the mysterious old rings on the ancient tree walls. It was unknown how many years had passed under the crisscross scars, but they were quickly covered by the gray aura. Crash! Suddenly a burst of water sound broke the silence here. Lu Chen suddenly sat up from the water, and then with great difficulty, slowly climbed out. Just like before, the black fire burns on his body once again miraculously disappeared, including the wound on his abdomen. And this pool of blue water was like the legendary water of immortality, time and time again pulled him back from the brink of death. But just as he climbed to the ground, gasping for breath, when he accidentally turned his head, suddenly, Lu Chen's body shook, as if he saw something shocking. He was dumbfounded. In the small pool of blue water beside him, the dark green color that symbolized the unimaginably rich life force, completely disappeared. At this moment, the puddle looked like an ordinary little pond. Lu Chen was stunned for a while. After a while, he slowly stood up, suddenly saw that under the clear water, there seemed to be a black shadow in the water. Chapter 33. Lu Chen was taken aback. He looked carefully and saw that in the depths of the water, there was a ball of water that was much more solid than its surroundings. It actually formed a round ball of water that floated motionlessly in the water. And in the center of the transparent ball of water, a small black flame was silently burning. Lu Chen silently looked at the small black flame and suddenly smiled bitterly. He didn't know why, but he strangely felt a sense of familiarity. At this moment, his whole body was powerless and incomparably weak. He slowly took a few steps back and then fell to the ground. After catching his breath for a moment, he sat down cross-legged and used his divine sense to examine his body. Under the nourishment of the mystical water of life, the terrifying wound in his dantian had actually healed. It looked empty, as if nothing had happened. Everything seemed to be starting over again. Lu Chen sat quietly. After a while, suddenly, in his dantian, a breath emerged. Then, like a miracle, in his dantian, a shadow flashed, and a brand new, almost intact 5 elements disc gradually floated up. A look of disbelief and ecstasy flashed across Lu Chen's face. But then he was startled. On the 5 elements disc, everything was like a newborn baby. There seemed to be nothing. It was far from the outstanding talent he had in the past. At this moment, the 5 elements divine disc was completely barren. Only at the center of the disc, in the position of the earth element, was a yellow divine pillar that was the lightest in color. It was only about an inch tall, and it stood alone in the center of the disc. Among all the cultivators in the world, this was the situation of having the worst aptitude and the worst foundation of cultivating the Tao. Lu Chen was silent for a while, then he shook his head and smiled bitterly, but he didn't seem too disappointed. Just when he was about to leave, the 5 elements divine plates suddenly trembled, and actually flipped over. The entire plate was flipped over. Lu Chen's face suddenly froze. The other side of the 5 elements divine disc, the other side of the 5 elements divine disc that no one had ever heard of before, was completely empty. Apart from a vast expanse of black, not even a blade of grass could be seen. In the center of this strange black divine disc, a tiny black flame was silently burning in the center of the divine disc. It was like the grin of a devil, slowly opening its mouth full of malicious fangs at Lu Chen. What the hell is this weather? A curse came from the tavern. Old Ma was sitting in his own tavern, wearing only a pair of underpants. His upper body was bare, revealing his white fat. He held a towel in his hand and kept wiping his face, wiping away the beads of sweat that kept oozing out. His mouth was also constantly muttering. Sitting opposite him, Lu Chen also looked a little listless. He lazily glanced at the fat man, frowned, and said with a look of disgust, "Is there anyone who does business like you? Dressed like this in broad daylight, who would dare to come and drink?" Old Ma snorted and said, "In this kind of damned weather, even cicadas can be roasted on such a hot day. Who would come here to drink?" Lu Chen didn't deny it, but didn't refute him. He just looked at the glass of wine on the table in front of him. Today's weather had become a little strange since the beginning of summer. It was much hotter than in previous years. According to the elders in the village, it had not been such a hot summer in at least 30 years. Perhaps something was going to happen when the weather changed. This was the long-winded words of those old men who pretended to be mysterious. But obviously, no one believed this kind of baseless words, and there was indeed no other abnormality except for a little hotter. Lu Chen opened his mouth and yawned. He leaned against the wall and slightly narrowed his eyes, looking a little sleepy. Old Ma wiped his sweat again, and then looked at Lu Chen with some envy, who didn't sweat at all on such a hot day. After a moment, he suddenly frowned and came over. Lu Chen immediately opened his eyes and said, "What are you doing?" Old Ma looked at him and whispered, "Young man, I feel that your body seems to be very weak. Did you overdo it? Listen to my advice, young people should take care of their body, don't wait." Before he could finish his words, Old Ma leaped backward and dodged a black foot from under the table with an agility that did not match his figure at all. He laughed and said, hurry up, you have a guilty conscience." "Guilty my ass." Lu Chen unhappily rolled his eyes at him. Old Ma laughed and used a towel to wipe his face. He walked back and sat down, and then casually said, "Speaking of this, I feel that you haven't been looking for ding-dang recently. Lu Chen coldly laughed and said, I'm tired of playing. I don't want to play anymore, okay? Yes, yes. Old Ma grinned and then raised his head to look at the big sun outside. His face became dejected and he muttered, why is the weather so hot? Lu Chen drank a mouthful of wine and was silent for a moment. He suddenly said, that's right, that Li Ji who was accepted into the Thousand Autumns sect a few days ago, how is he doing? Old Ma snorted and said, it's not like I know everything. What does the cultivation sect's matters have to do with this village? Lu Chen laughed and only looked at Old Ma. Old Ma's mouth twitched, then he lightly said, that bastard's talent is really not bad. I heard that after he entered the sect, he quickly won the favor of one of the Thousand Autumns sect's elders and is prepared to accept him as a disciple. His future is bright. Lu Chen nodded and said, sounds good. Old Ma said, a sparrow flying on a branch turns into a phoenix. Lu Chen said, then has he ever returned to Qingshidang village? Old Ma laughed and said, of course not. With his current status, who cares about this broken village? Lu Chen thought about it and said, you're right. Boom. Suddenly, a loud noise came from outside the tavern like a bolt from the blue. Moreover, the sound seemed to have come from the sky above the village. Lu Chen and Old Ma were both shocked. They looked at each other, then stood up and ran out of the tavern at the same time. At the same time, when they ran out of the gate, they saw many people in the surrounding houses running out as well. Obviously, they were all alarmed by the sudden loud noise. At this moment, many people in Qingshidang village looked up at the same time. The sky was clear and the sun was high in the sky. There were no clouds in the sky and it looked like a hot day. Not to mention the usual dark clouds during thunder, there were not even a few white clouds. What was going on? Chapter 34. Just when everyone was astonished, someone suddenly cried out in surprise and pointed to a certain place in the sky. Sure enough, a black dot suddenly appeared high up in the sky in that direction, and it descended rapidly. Not long after, it vaguely seemed to be a human figure. At this moment, everyone was instantly in an uproar, and exclamations rose and fell. At the entrance of the tavern, Old Ma and Lu Chen's expressions changed slightly, and they glanced at each other in unison. Old Ma whispered, a cultivator? Lu Chen was silent for a moment. He nodded and whispered, it should be. He lost control of his flight and fell. Old Ma clenched his teeth and his expression became a bit more serious. Everyone in the cultivation world knew that to be able to fly, one had to be at least at the initial stage of the foundation realm. In a cultivation sect like the Thousand Years sect, a foundation realm cultivator was the strongest. The speed of the black shadow falling from the sky became faster and faster, and it even brought with it a sharp whistling sound. The direction of the falling shadow was also falling towards the village. For a moment, everyone was in an uproar, and they all retreated, getting as far away from the falling shadow as possible. Not long after, a black shadow descended from the sky. As countless people screamed in shock, a loud bang rang out as it smashed into a house, creating a large hole in the roof. Dust immediately filled the air, and it felt like even the ground under its feet was trembling. The scene was so horrifying that even though everyone was just watching, they couldn't help but feel a chill run down their spines in this scorching hot weather. After a moment, everyone slowly surrounded the house. Lu Chen and Old Ma were also mixed in the crowd. The owner of the unlucky house was standing outside the house, dumbfounded. He looked like he wanted to cry but no tears would come out. Soon, everyone saw the figure through the open door. It looked like an old man in his 50s. His body was lying limply on the ground. Blood flowed out of his orifices and he looked like he was dead. It was unknown how many bones were broken in his body, but he looked very miserable. The timid villagers had already retreated in fear, while the braver ones turned pale. Some of them even started to retch. At this time, someone suddenly exclaimed, pointing at the corpse, this person's clothes, it's the uniform of the Thousand Autumns sect's immortal elder. Everyone was shocked and turned their heads to look. Sure enough, they found the person to be somewhat familiar. Immediately, another uproar broke out and they all retreated. Old Ma and Lu Chen followed the crowd and walked to the back. Old Ma looked around to make sure no one was around and said in a low voice, "It's Elder Su Yunhe from the Thousand Autumn Gate." Lu Chen raised his eyebrows slightly and glanced at him, wanting to say something but hesitating. Old Ma saw his expression and frowned. "What's wrong?" After a moment of silence, Lu Chen said, "He was already dead when he fell. The fatal wound was on his chest. His Taoist robe on his right shoulder was torn. Though it's covered by blood, there's a metal plate stuck there. It should be the pattern of a giant tree." At this point, he paused. Old Ma's expression changed slightly. Lu Chen turned to look at Old Ma and said, "It's the work of the demon sect of the Three Realms. It's probably revenge for what happened a few days ago." Old Ma gritted his teeth and suddenly spat. He cursed under his breath, "A bunch of lunatics." Qingshitang village was near South Pine Mountain and was considered to be within the Thousand Autumn Gate sphere of influence. Thus, the clothes on the dead man were quickly recognized. After another half a day, a large group of cultivators from the Thousand Autumn Gate arrived at Qingshitang village. The peace of the past was, of course, nowhere to be found. However, the village was not noisy at all. The reason was simple. In front of the stern-looking Thousand Autumn Gate cultivators, the atmosphere in Qingshitang village was solemn. There were Thousand Autumn Gate disciples guarding the front and back of the village. Most of the villagers were as quiet as cicadas in winter, not even daring to breathe too loudly. The area near the dead man had the most Thousand Autumn Gate cultivators and seemed to have the highest status there. From time to time, someone would come out from that area and summon a few villagers for questioning. At this moment, Old Ma finally put on some clothes and was no longer naked. He stood with Lu Chen in the distance and looked at the house. After watching for a while, Lu Chen quietly nudged Old Ma and whispered, "I'm afraid the Thousand Autumn Gate is going to be furious." Old Ma shrugged and said, "Of course. Su Yunhe is at the peak of the foundational realm and is one of the two people with the highest cultivation in the gate. Aside from the gate leader, he is the next highest. The devil cult is really ruthless this time. It's equivalent to losing at least 30% of the Thousand Autumn Gate strength." Lu Chen shook his head without much expression on his face. Old Ma looked at him and lowered his voice. "It's rare for the devil cult to make such a big move." Lu Chen frowned and didn't say anything. After a while, he whispered, "The pattern under the tree a few days ago, maybe it's for this?" Old Ma thought about it and nodded. "It should be, but this is good. At least it's not for you." Lu Chen raised his head and looked ahead. A few villagers had been brought out by the Thousand Autumn's clan disciples, but no more villagers were called over for questioning. It was probably because the villagers here all spoke the same words, and there was no need to ask any more questions. But at this moment, his eyes suddenly narrowed and he let out a sound of surprise. His eyes stared at a certain spot in the crowd. Old Ma followed his gaze and after a while, he was also startled. Outside one of the houses, there was a group of 7 or 8 Thousand Autumn's clan disciples. Among them, there was a handsome man. It was Li Ji. It had been a long time since they last saw each other, but this talented and extremely lucky young man did not seem to have changed at all. He was still as carefree and elegant as ever, and when he stood among a group of cultivators, he seemed to stand out from the crowd. Many villagers in the surroundings saw Li Ji and gasped in surprise. Obviously, everyone was very envious of him. This was especially so for some of the young women. Their eyes were practically shining as they stared at Li Ji. It was as if Li Ji turned around to look at them, they would be enchanted. Old Ma shook his head and smiled at Lu Chen. "What a good appearance. I'm so envious." Lu Chen didn't reply. He stared at Li Ji for a while and then looked away. But at this time, from the corner of his eyes, he suddenly saw that in a secluded corner of the crowd, Miss Ding Dang was standing under a withered peach tree. She was looking at Li Ji from afar. Her eyes were bright and her face seemed to be shining with light. She was exceptionally beautiful. Chapter 35. By evening, Elder Su Yunha's remains had been moved away by the Thousand Autumn sect. However, the Thousand Autumn sect disciples who were guarding the village did not retreat. Instead, they searched the village carefully, but in the end, they did not find anyone suspicious. After all, everyone here was someone who had been here for many years. In the end, they had no choice but to retreat. Of course, this was not a trivial matter. One could imagine the huge waves that would be stirred up in Thousand Autumn sect. Because the demonic cult of the Three Realms, which had kept an unusually low profile for the past 10 years, had suddenly changed their ways and carried out such a violent vengeance. After Thousand Autumn sect reported this to the true Immortal League, what kind of undercurrents would flow in the middle of the righteous path? However, to the villagers of Qingshitang village, and to most of the ordinary villagers, this was something that was too far away. After the Thousand Autumn sect's men left, Qingshitang village quickly regained its peace. The only person who was still indignant was the unlucky owner of the house whose roof had been smashed. However, he did not dare to speak to the Thousand Autumn sect about this unexpected disaster, and in the end, he could only let the matter rest. However, in the eyes of some people, there seemed to be some inconspicuous changes in this peaceful village. After all, it was not the same as before. Lu Chen's life seemed to be the same as most people's. There was no change. He still strolled around every day with a harmless smile on his face. He was like a young man who had hope in cultivation but was unwilling to endure hardship. He was ready to live out his life leisurely like this. He was kind and amiable to most of the people in Clearwater Pond. Everyone knew him and liked him. However, if one were to really think about it, it seemed like no one could really become close friends with him. Year after year, he maintained a distance between himself and most people, quietly living his life. Every time the sky turned dark, he would return to the lonely straw hut at the foot of the mountain alone. For some reason, Lu Chen did not dislike the darkness like most people did. In fact, he seemed to prefer it. Every time night came, lying in the straw hut was the time when he felt the most freedom. In the darkness, his thoughts would spread endlessly, and he would think of many things in the past. Perhaps, he could do some secrets that others could not know about. That night, the reborn divine disk of 5 elements reappeared in his Dantian's Sea of Qi. Even though this disk had relied on the last bit of water of life in that mysterious tree hole to be reborn, it looked exceptionally inferior. Even a sect like the Thousand Autumn sect would probably refuse to enter if they saw this kind of cultivation foundation under the immortal mirror. Even so, Lu Chen was still very happy, if this 5 elements divine disk didn't have another side. As the disk silently turned, the black side was revealed again. After a period of adaptation and exploration, Lu Chen gradually understood what had happened in his Dantian. The black flame curse that had troubled him for 10 years seemed to have disappeared. It seemed like it had perished together with the life water. However, for some reason, the reborn 5 elements divine disk in his body, the foundation of a cultivator, had undergone a strange change. On the normal side of the disk, the 4 elemental pillars of metal, wood, water, and fire did not appear. Only the earth elemental pillar in the center had the lowest and shallowest pillar. This meant that although Lu Chen still had the body of a mortal, he once again had the foundation to cultivate. It was just that his innate talent was terrible, so he could only cultivate earth-type cultivation methods. Moreover, the speed of his cultivation of Dao techniques and divine abilities would be extremely slow. However, all of this was not too difficult for Lu Chen. Being able to regenerate the disc was the greatest gift to him. What surprised him was the other side of the disc, the black side. In this world, at least as far as he could remember, he had never heard of such a thing since ancient times. Firstly, the 5 elements divine disc had never had a positive or negative concept. Secondly, there had never been a black and empty 5 elements divine disc. In the darkness, he quietly looked at the black side of the 5 elements divine disc. He looked at the familiar little black flame in the center of the disc. Then, he held his breath and slowly tried to activate that ball of flame. His divine sense was like a rope, slowly approaching that small cluster of black flames. In the darkness that no one knew about, in the silence, at a certain moment, his eyes suddenly opened. There was no pain or emotion, but in his calm and solemn gaze, there seemed to be two balls of dark flames flashing in his eye sockets. It was the height of summer in July, and the weather was getting hotter and hotter. However, because there was a clear stream that seemed to never dry up flowing through the village, the people of Qingshidang village were still living a more comfortable life than other places. One day when it was close to the end of the month, someone suddenly knocked on Lu Chen's straw hut. He opened the door and saw Ding Dang standing outside. Under the sunlight, she was still as beautiful as ever. Even though her face was a little red from the heat and there were a few drops of sweat on her forehead, she smiled when she saw Lu Chen and waved her hand to greet him. Lu Chen smiled and let her in. He said, "Why did you think of looking for me? What's the matter?" Ding Dang seemed to be in a good mood and very happy, as if something good had happened. She said to Lu Chen, "Can you do me a favor?" Lu Chen looked at her, and Ding Dang's face suddenly turned red, as if she had thought of something. Embarrassed, she smiled awkwardly and said, I still haven't collected enough spirit stones. Can I pay you back after a while?" Lu Chen indifferently waved his hands and said, "That's not a problem. I'm not in a rush to use the money." "Speak, why are you looking for me today?" Ding Dang said, "Bring me to the Dragon Lake behind the mountain." "Dragon Lake?" "Yes." Ding Dang nodded her head vigorously and then happily smiled. "Why are you going to the Dragon Lake?" Lu Chen was a little flabbergasted and said, "The mountain is high and the road is long. The mountain path is not easy to walk and usually I don't see a shadow of a person. Why are you going there?" Ding Dang smiled, the joy in her eyes seemed to be unable to be suppressed. She looked like a proud hen that had just laid an egg and couldn't help but want to show off. But in the end, she seemed to be able to endure it. However, the smile in her eyes was like rippling water. She gently said to Lu Chen, "I heard that the scenery there is very good, so I wanted to go and take a look." She spread her hands and said helplessly, "I've been in Qingshidang village for a few years and have never been to this tea mountain. I heard that the mountain path is like a maze. I thought about it and only you can help me." Chapter 36. Lu Chen stared at the girl in front of him. Under the morning light, her snow-white skin and slightly red cheeks made her seem like a peach blossom that had bloomed in this world. She was charming and enchanting, emitting a dazzling radiance. After a moment, he nodded and said, "Okay, I will bring you there." Ding Dang cheered, smiling as she pulled on Lu Chen's sleeves, her eyes emitting a bright and amiable light, smiling, "Many thanks, I knew, you are a good person." Lu Chen smiled, declining to comment, and said, "The Dragon Lake is in the west of Tea Mountain. We will need at least 4 hours to walk there. Do you want to prepare a bit, or do you want to leave now?" Ding Dang clenched her fist, looking very excited. Her mood was anxious, and said, "Let's go now." Tea Mountain was not a towering mountain. Looking at it from the foot of the mountain was ordinary, but as the saying goes, looking at the mountain will cause the horse to run to death. Once truly walking up the mountain, the feeling was completely different. Especially the walking Lu Chen and Ding Dang, both were not cultivators, and were no different from ordinary mortals, so walking up the mountain was even more strenuous. Between the two, Lu Chen's physique was clearly much stronger than Ding Dong's. Along the way he walked, most of the time it was very easy, adding on to the fact that he was very familiar with the paths of Tea Mountain, bringing Ding Dang through the countless crisscrossing paths like a maze, his demeanor calm and at ease. On the other hand, although Ding Dang was full of energy at the start, not even half an hour later, her face gradually became pale, beads of sweat flowed down her face, and her breathing gradually became rough. She looked as if she had never done any heavy work before, nor did she have the appearance of someone who had walked long distances. Walking like this for a while, Lu Chen saw that Ding Dang could not hold on any longer, and could only stop to let her rest for a while. Ding Dang did not say anything, directly found a rock by the side of the mountain path, and sat down, gasping for breath, looking as if her whole body was about to go limp. Lu Chen shook his head, and said to her, "You can't walk like this, why don't you go back first?" Although Ding Dong's face was pale white, but for some reason, she was extremely determined. She firmly shook her head and said, "No need, I will be fine after resting for a while." Lu Chen shrugged and stopped talking. The two of them rested for the time it took to drink a cup of tea before Ding Dang stood up and said to Lu Chen, "Let's go." The two of them continued to walk forward. The mountain breeze blew, and the tea trees that covered the mountains and plains rustled, like a green ocean. Ding Dong's stamina was only at this level, and for the rest of the journey, she would be so tired that she would not be able to move. Lu Chen could only stop to let her recover her stamina, and like this, time was wasted. According to Lu Chen's original plan, it would take about 4 hours to reach the Dragon Lake, but like this, the two of them spent more than half a day before they saw the calm lake at the top of the mountain. Although it took a lot of time, Lu Chen seemed to be extremely patient, and from start to finish, he did not show any impatience towards Ding Dang. On the contrary, Ding Dang was a little embarrassed, and said "sorry" to Lu Chen a few times, but was always laughed off by Lu Chen. But Lu Chen was also a little surprised that Ding Dang was able to persevere and walk all the way to the Dragon Lake, and had a whole new level of respect for this girl. When they walked to the side of the Dragon Lake, he pointed to the calm surface of the water, and said to Ding Dang, "This is the Dragon Lake." Ding Dang walked 2 steps forward, only to feel a cool breeze blowing over, bringing with it a moist and gentle aura, causing her to take a deep breath, and her face revealed a satisfied and happy expression. She still wanted to walk forward, but was suddenly pulled back by Lu Chen. Ding Dang was shocked, and turned her head. "What's wrong?" Lu Chen looked at the distant Dragon Lake, and said, "Don't get too close to the lake." Ding Dang asked, "Why?" Lu Chen said, "I heard people say that there seems to be a strange fish in the Dragon Lake. Its body is rather big, and it's a little strange, maybe it will hurt people." Ding Dong's eyes widened, and said, "What, you've seen it before?" Lu Chen shook his head, and said, "I heard people say it, I've come here a few times, but I've never seen it before." Ding Dang could not help but laugh, and said, "Then you still believe it?" Lu Chen laughed and shrugged his shoulders, and said, "Who knows, anyways you can see the scenery from afar, as long as you don't get too close to the lake, it'll be fine." Ding Dang nodded her head, and then looked at Lu Chen, and said, "Lu Chen, thank you for bringing me up, I'll be fine by myself, you can go back first." Lu Chen was startled, and said in shock, "What? Then what will you do when you go back?" Ding Dang waved her hands, and said with a smile, "I'm not a child, I'll walk the way back myself. Right now I just want to stay here alone for a while, you can go back first." Lu Chen was silent for a moment, and then raised his head to look at the sky, and said, "It's already getting late. When you go down the mountain alone, it will most likely be dark, and at that time the mountain path will be even harder to walk. Can you really do it?" Ding Dang hesitated for a moment, but her expression was still resolute, and heavily nodded her head, and said, "I'll be fine, you don't have to worry, I just want to stay here alone for a while." Lu Chen looked at her for a moment, and then did not say anything, and only nodded his head, and said, "All right then, you be careful." With that, he turned around and walked back the way he came. Ding Dang looked at his back figure walking away, and a complicated expression flitted across her face. It seemed to be a bit gentle, but also seemed to be a bit apologetic, but very quickly she still turned around, and once again looked at the calm lake. Just at this time, footsteps suddenly sounded out from behind her. Ding Dang turned around to look, and was immediately startled. It was Lu Chen who had returned. She saw Lu Chen walk over with large strides, and in his hand was an object, and stuffed it into Ding Dong's hands. Ding Dang lowered her head to look, and saw that it was a torch, and then she heard Lu Chen lightly say, "When you go down the mountain, if it's dark and you don't know the way, then break a few pieces of firewood to use as a torch, and then wave it towards the foot of the mountain. If you're lucky, I'll see you and come up the mountain to pick you up, but if I forget about this matter, or fall asleep, then you can only blame your own bad luck." Ding Dong's slender white fingers gently clenched, holding onto the torch in her palm. She then raised her head to look at Lu Chen, her eyes as clear as water. After a moment she suddenly smiled sweetly, nodded and said, "All right." Lu Chen laughed, and turned around, not looking back, and not long after, he disappeared at the end of the mountain path. Ding Dang looked at the man's disappearing figure, a light flashed in her eyes, and no one knew what she was thinking about. Chapter 37. However, just as Lu Chen left, Ding Dang seemed to have sensed something. She turned towards the direction of the Dragon Lake and saw a figure appear from behind a large rock by the lakeside. Ding Dong's lips curled into a joyful smile. She tucked the fire lighter into her bosom and strode towards that direction. Tea Mountain and Qingshitang Village were just inconspicuous villages under the influence of the Qianxiu sect in South Pine Mountain. The Qianxiu sect itself was actually just an inconspicuous small sect in the incomparably powerful cultivation world of Middle-earth. On the vast and boundless Middle-earth, there were billions of living beings, countless powerful cultivation sects and cultivators, just like the stars in the night sky. In the current human cultivation world, Xianxianmeng was fully deserving of the title of number one power in the world. This was because it was not just a single sect. In fact, Xianxianmeng was an alliance of hundreds and thousands of powerful cultivation sections. As long as one was famous in Middle-earth, their strength could be seen on the stage. Other than heretical existences like the Three Realms Divine Sect, the rest were almost all members of Xianxianmeng. This huge organization had a very long history. In the long years, this special and huge organization had formed a foundation that was different from all the other cultivation sects, and that was the Immortal City. Most of the cultivation sects in the world, no matter big or small, were like the Thousand Autumn sect. They occupied a blessed land for their disciples to cultivate, and then naturally developed a city at the foot of the mountain next to the spiritual land. However, the true Immortal Alliance did not do so. This organization directly built a huge city on the most fertile and vast land of the Middle-earth, the Four Rivers Plain. After many years of expansion and repair, the Immortal City was already the most prosperous and powerful city in Middle-earth. It was also the most desirable city. All of the important sects of Xianxianmeng were also located in this city. In the huge and ancient city, there were countless people living, bustling with activity, coming and going. Between the intersection of light and darkness, there were countless sorrows and joys of separation and reunion. There was light and there was darkness. It was like the sun rising and setting, an endless cycle of reincarnation. Inside the huge city, there was an extremely secretive place. It looked like a secret room, but it was also very spacious. There was a large round table in the room. The center of the table was empty, and a ball of flame was burning on it. The flame swayed silently, but if one looked closely, they would find that under the light of the flame, there was a pile of strange bones. They looked like beasts, but not beasts. They looked ferocious and terrifying, and even looked a little like the faces of evil spirits in ancient legends. Apart from that, there was only a lone figure sitting on a high-backed iron chair at the big round table with 11 seats in the room. It was a person shrouded in a black and red robe. There was also a hooded cloak on his back, covering his hair and neck. In front of his face, he even wore a golden mask. In other words, other than a pair of eyes, this person did not reveal a single inch of skin. The golden mask was carved with the face of a terrifying evil spirit. It looked a little like the burning bones at the center of the table, and it also added a gloomy aura to the figure. The entire secret room was silent. This mysterious masked man just sat there quietly, staring at the burning ball of flame. He did not move for a long time. The fire burned fiercely, and it was reflected in his pupils, as if there were two balls of flame burning in the depths of his eyes. After an unknown amount of time, suddenly, a soft sound came from a corner of the secret room. Then, a door appeared from the shadows, and a person pushed the door open and walked in. It was a man who looked to be in his 30s. His face was ordinary, and he looked like the kind of person that could be seen on the streets every day. Even his clothes were very ordinary, and he would not attract anyone's attention. The man's eyes swept around the secret room, and soon fell on the mysterious figure beside the strange round table. His face tightened, and there was a hint of nervousness in the depths of his eyes. But his expression did not change much. He quickly walked over, and with a table between them, he bowed respectfully. Chen, he greets the elder. The head of the man wearing the golden evil spirit mask moved slightly, and then he looked at him. After a moment, a strange voice sounded. It was hoarse and low, and it sounded like metal and stone crisscrossing. For a moment, it was impossible to tell whether it was a man or a woman. He only felt a dull pain in his eardrums. How was the interrogation? Xianxia took a deep breath, and his head was slightly lowered. That guy couldn't withstand the punishment, and he's already dead. But from what he said before he died, he should not know Hei Lang of the past. The flame in the secret room suddenly sprang up, like a silent and terrible evil spirit, and suddenly roared. It was hair-raising. A suffocating silence suddenly descended upon this dark secret chamber. The man named Xianxia stood there like a javelin, his eyes looking down at his nose looking down at his heart, not even daring to breathe loudly. After a while, the burning flame gradually calmed down, and the golden evil spirit mask raised its head again. The strange and hoarse voice sounded again. Almost all the fish that escaped the net in the Battle of the Barren Valley have been investigated, and there is still nothing. What do you plan to do next? Xianxia was silent for a moment, and then said, after the disaster 10 years ago, the traitor disappeared without a trace. Although we have been trying hard to track him down, every time we find a clue, it is either cut off by others, or it alarms some forces in Zhengxiameng, and they often backfire on us. From this, we can see that there is an extremely powerful force in Zhengxiameng that is protecting the traitor. Behind the golden evil spirit mask, there seemed to be a cold snort full of hatred and viciousness. Go on. Xianxia said in a low voice, I think that the traitor is not in the celestial city now. Perhaps he is hidden by some big shot in some corner of the world, or even in some random small sect, pretending to be a harmless nobody to humans and animals, so that he can avoid being hunted by us. There was no reply from behind the mask. Xianxia paused for a moment, then said, so in my opinion, maybe we should change to another method. What is it? The golden mask moved slightly, as if it was a little moved. In the past 10 years, all kinds of signs show that Zhengxiameng is inextricably linked to the Battle of the Barren Valley. So if we want to find the traitor, Hei Lang, we should also put more effort into Zhengxiameng. Previously, it was too difficult to find a way among the many cultivation sections. Chapter 38. The golden-masked man was silent for a while, then nodded slowly and said, what you said makes some sense. However, over the years, there have been spies lurking in Zhengxiameng to investigate this matter, but they have not found anything. Do you have any new ideas? Xianxia shook his head and said, this kind of thing is the same. We can only investigate carefully and trace every little bit of the past. The Floating Clouds Division of the True Immortal Alliance has always protected those shadows whose identities and origins are extremely secretive. We don't know how many secrets are hidden within it, and it has also been the focus of our investigation for many years. It's just that the results have not been obvious all these years. At this point, Xianxia paused for a while, then his eyes flashed and he said, but I have an idea that might be helpful. Say it. In the past, we have always tried our best to track down those shadows whose identities and origins are very mysterious, but it often takes twice the effort for half the result. However, these days, I have been secretly thinking, maybe we can change our idea and start from those who come into contact with the shadows? The golden-masked man suddenly raised his head. Obviously, this sentence had aroused his interest. Xianxia immediately noticed this, and a hint of joy flashed in his eyes, but his expression did not change. He continued to say, Zhengxiameng has always attached great importance to the safety of the shadows, and the protection is extremely tight. However, people who come into contact with the shadows, such as inspectors, surveillance, and other people, although they also have their own ways of keeping secrets, are often in the open, such as the personal disciples of the major sections. So, if we start from these people and follow the clues, very good. Let's do this. A shout directly interrupted Xianxia's words. Xianxia was not angry, but happy. He quickly bowed and said, yes, I will obey. The golden-masked man slowly stood up, his eyes staring at the terrifying skeletons in the fire in front of him. Suddenly, he let out a low roar, like the roar of an evil spirit, which made people tremble with fear. A sound of hatred came from behind the mask, and he said coldly, the great foundation of the divine sect, and the lives of the 3 elders, should have been the most prosperous situation in the past 500 years, but it was all destroyed in the hands of that traitor. If this fiend doesn't die, how can our god sect live? As soon as he finished speaking, he suddenly waved one of his arms, and with a boom, a ball of flames rose up, the fire blazed, as if it wanted to swallow the world, and in the roaring flames, that voice also seemed to be burning, like metal striking stone, like a hoarse roar, shouting and cursing towards the darkness. Crush the bones and scatter the ashes. Soul extraction and soul refining. Let him die. Night fell as usual. The strange and mournful wails of ghosts and the wind once again spread throughout the tea mountain. In the darkness of the night, Lu Qin stood outside the hut and glanced at the tea mountain. All he saw was silence and deep. The darkness was as thick as an ink-smeared painting. He stood there expressionlessly for a moment, then walked back to the hut, lay down on the bed, closed his eyes, and fell asleep without a sound. The next time he saw Ding Dang, it was already 2 days later. At that time it was morning. Ding Dang was walking by a clear stream in the village. Her beautiful appearance was like the most beautiful peach blossom, dazzling, and in this season where the peach blossoms had already withered, she was still in full bloom, attracting the gazes of countless people in the village. But she did not care about the surrounding gazes. Her eyes were so bright, as if she was standing on the clouds, disdaining the dust, and also as if she was a person with a different fate. Even the people who greeted her rarely paid attention. She kept smiling, but did not show her smile to anyone. She was happy from the bottom of her heart, but only wanted to let herself be happy, and was not willing to give even a little bit to the people beside her. Until she saw Lu Qin standing at the entrance of the small wine shop. Ding Dang stopped for the first time. A trace of hesitation flashed across her face, and then she warmly smiled at Lu Qin from afar. Like a peach blossom in the spring wind, tender and beautiful, but also seemed to have a bit of reserved nobility, causing people to not dare to approach. Lu Qin returned a smile, nodded to her, and then turned to walk into the small wine shop. Old Ma sat at the table. The wine shop was still not doing well, so his face did not look good. Lu Qin walked to his side, sat down, and asked with a smile, "What is it?" Old Ma glanced at him, and said unhappily, "You already know the answer, but still ask." Lu Qin laughed, "You are not really relying on this wine shop to make a living. Why are you looking at it so seriously?" Old Ma snorted, went to the counter to get a jug of wine, and threw it to him, then said in a low voice, "The matter with Su Yunhe from the Thousand Autumns sect has already been spread back to Zhengxiameng. I heard that the higher-ups are furious, and are investigating this matter." Lu Qin poured a cup of wine, thought for a moment, and said, "This matter is indeed a bit over the line, but it is also a bit strange. At least for more than 10 years, the Three Realms Divine sect has not done something so out of line." Old Ma shrugged, and said, "Maybe these years they have been suppressed too much, or maybe there is a new figure in the evil sect, and in order to establish their power, they killed the chicken to scare the monkey or something." As he spoke, he looked at Lu Qin and said, "Hey, tell me, why is it that the evil sect, this broken thing, how many times have they been beaten and destroyed, yet they are able to survive every time, dying like an unkillable bug?" Lu Qin was silent. After a while, his voice suddenly became a bit lower, and he said, "Maybe it is because the people in there are especially simple-minded, believing in some things to the point that even we can't understand." Old Ma's expression changed slightly, looked at Lu Qin's expression, and then coughed, but changed the topic, and said, "Oh yes, there is news from old Lu. He has already handed over all the matters at Immortal City, and will officially retire in a few days to go back to his original sect." Lu Qin nodded, and said, "That is not bad. Old Lu is a good person." The two of them chatted casually in the tavern, just like they had done countless times in the past. In this ordinary mountain village, the two of them looked like ordinary people, staying in the most ordinary corner of the world, quietly living an ordinary and leisurely life. At noon, when Lu Qin was about to walk out of the door, he suddenly heard Old Ma suddenly said, "You seem to look good these days." Lu Qin's body paused for a moment, smiled, and did not say anything, and walked out. He walked all the way back to the hut at the foot of Tea Mountain, closed the door, and sat cross-legged on the bed. Not long after, in his Qi Si, the brand new but the most ordinary 5 elements divine disc slowly emerged. Lu Qin's face was calm, and he just quietly adjusted his breath. Gradually, a very subtle spiritual power appeared in his Qi meridian, and slowly flowed. You're tuning into the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.